seems appropriate to bring up Ms. O'Malley and see if we can get our little pretty blue papers distributed and our fancy new chart, and allow everybody to
the yellow brick road.
My yellow brick road, my favorite yellow brick road. For all of us to get this sort of baseline thinking going about how we fund state and local governments and what one might do to pull some of the strings out of the pile of tiered layer cake or something. Anyway, so we got that, and we have the overall overview, and there you go. That's why I have her do it this way, because a visual, it makes it really scary. All right. So, Ms. O'Malley.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. Marianne O'Malley with the Legislative Analyst Office. I'll be working off of two documents today. The first is the overview, this blue handout, and then the second is the major milestones, the large copy, as we joke, suitable for framing. In the handout on the first page, it starts to walk you through a little bit of the background. And if I could just start for a moment and say that the framers of the U.S. Constitution didn't include a single reference to local government in the U.S. Constitution, leaving it to the states to decide how communities and regions should be governed. Yet the fact that throughout the United States, each of the 50 states created systems of local government suggests that there's something about local government that resonates with many Americans. The concept of being able to have some kind of local control over your local services. Throughout the United States, most of the states have counties, and counties usually wear two different hats. One is administrative arms of the state, and the other is a provider of local services. 48 of our states have something like a county. They may call them a parish, they may call them a borough, but there's something like a county. Almost all of the states have cities, and they usually give them at least land use control, land use powers, if not also public protection. Virtually all of the states have special districts, and virtually all the states have school districts, although some cases the school district is a subsidiary of the city, or in some cases the county. If you turn to page 2, I have an overview of California's approach to local government. And while this may appear complex, it's important to know that Californians actually have fewer local governments per capita than almost anywhere else in the United States. To start with, we have 58 counties, the same number we've had for over 100 years. Our counties in California wear three hats. The first hat is the administrative arm of the state for providing a variety of health and social services programs. The second hat is provider of county-wide programs like the district attorney, your county jails, county elections. And the third hat is the provider of local municipal services. And that's really different if you live in a county like Trinity that doesn't have any cities versus Orange, where about 90% of the people live in an incorporated city. In California, if you look at our county budgets, about 2/3 of their revenues come from the state government or the federal government. And about 1/3 of that is a local source, either local fees or local taxes. So about 2/3 from the state or feds and about 1/3 from the local. If you look at counties elsewhere in the United States, it's almost the exact opposite. And the key difference is our counties play a much larger role as a provider of health and social services programs than counties elsewhere in the United States. I should point out, though, that counties elsewhere in the United States typically are much smaller than California counties. On average, they're about 100,000 people. Okay, so LA County would be about 90 counties. Our counties are large, and they are a size, in many cases, of some smaller and medium-sized states. In California, we have 480 cities. That number is growing as communities desire greater control over local public protection and land use. Since 1997, we've added 10 new cities, and I noticed just in this June election that there was an 11th in the county of Riverside that will be incorporated, Eastdale. Our cities are very different than our counties in that they really do not provide health and social services programs. They mostly provide public protection, their land use control, they provide local municipal services. Our cities in California, in contrast to our counties, provide a narrower scope of services than cities elsewhere in the United States. Our cities, for example, do not have authority over educational programs. The next is redevelopment agencies. We have 425 of them. Most are associated with cities, but there are some counties that have redevelopment agencies as well. They have two extraordinary powers. They have the power to redirect property tax revenue distribution so that they get the growth, the increase in property taxes. And they also have authority over eminent domain. The number of redevelopment project areas has doubled since the 1980s. On a financial scale, we're much more active on the redevelopment side than other states. Statewide, redevelopment agencies get almost 12% of the countywide property tax. And we have a couple counties where they get more than $1 out of $4 that are collected on the property tax. The next is our special districts. We have a lot of special districts, over 3,400 of them. That number is actually declining slowly over time as some cities incorporated and as some smaller special districts merge. Some of them are dependent special districts, and that means they're basically governed by the city or the county. And some of them are independent districts, and that means that they have an independently elected board, or the members are appointed for a term. And then last, we have over 1,000 K-12 and community college districts. That number has been slowly, very slowly declining over time, principally because of the merger between elementary school districts and high school districts becoming unified districts. If you turn to the next page, we have key factors in the California system of government. The first is, while all states limit the authority of their local governments to raise revenues, in California, our local governments have much more constrained authority to raise tax revenues than many other local governments elsewhere in the United States. In California, our local governments do not have authority to raise the 1% general purpose property tax, nor do they have authority to reallocate how much of the property tax goes to the city versus the county versus the special district. And of course, all other taxes at the local level require either approval by the majority of local residents or 2/3 of local residents, depending upon the purposes to which the tax would be put. The next I talked on a little bit, we have a much bigger county role, much more robust county role than counties elsewhere in the United States. The next, greater use of redevelopment. Virtually every state in the United States has some form of redevelopment. Our use of redevelopment programs is much more stronger than elsewhere in the United States. The next one is important. We have a blurred lines between state and local resources and responsibilities. Throughout the conference deliberations, I've heard mention of, gee, isn't that really a local program, or isn't that really a state program? And it's so hard to be able to sort it out. Take the most classic of all kinds of programs, county elections. You'd think, well, that's a county responsibility, right? But if you take a look at the funding for county elections, you find out, gee, a lot of that's a mandate, and we reimburse it, all the absentee ballots. So it goes under item 8885 of the state's budget, providing funding for what is a county program. It's very difficult to isolate any program and to say, is it entirely state-funded or a local program, or locally funded, and who's got policy control over the program. And then the next one is there's significant recent changes in state local duties and responsibilities. And now I bring you to what your chair refers to as the yellow brick road. Now, a conversation about all of these things, the last time I did it, I think it took a little over 2 hours. I was going to suggest that I highlight 4 of them. And if you had any other ones that you'd like to talk about, I'd be happy to take questions on it. But I thought that the 4 that might be most interesting to you today would be Proposition 13, AB 8, which followed 13, realignment, and Proposition 1A of 2004. So the next couple pages on your handout address those. If you're following along on the yellow brick road, you'd be right around here for Proposition 13, and then right next for the AB 8. In terms of Proposition 13, it is most famous for providing major and ongoing property tax relief to property tax owners. And if you turn to page 5 of the handout, you can see the first 2 bullets summarize those provisions of Proposition 13. It set that the maximum property tax rate at 1%, and it also shifted the assessment of property from market-based to acquisition value. And those are the 2 most commonly referenced pieces of Proposition 13. There are 2 other pieces, though, that oftentimes don't get discussed, and I wanted to mention them as well today. The third bullet is the allocation of the property tax. Proposition 13 also was a very significant governance change. It shifted the authority of allocating the property tax from local communities to the state. It made the property tax allocated in accordance to law. So it's a very significant governance change in terms of the change of authority over the property tax. The other piece of Proposition 13 is the constraint on other taxes besides the property tax. It specified that any kind of new or increased state taxes would require 2/3 vote of the legislature, or at the local level, special taxes would require 2/3 vote of the local voters. So those are the major provisions of Proposition 13. The next step along the road, on the yellow brick road, is AB 8. And if you may remember, Proposition 13 passed in June of 1978. And there was a very active year-long period of trying to sort out how the legislature was going to respond to Proposition 13. And AB 8 of 1979 is the implementing legislation. And there are 3 bullets on this page, and I just want to summarize. The first 2 were basically the legislature's effort to provide fiscal relief to local governments. A major source of their revenues had been decreased, and the legislature wanted to use its authority and use some revenues that it had at the time to be able to provide ongoing fiscal relief to local governments. And it did so in 2 ways. First, with counties, because they are an administrative arm of the state adjusted some state-local cost-sharing arrangements in a way that absorbed, on an ongoing basis, about $1 billion worth of county cost. And that was primarily in the predecessor to the CalWORKs program, the AFDC, Medi-Cal, and SSI-SSP. So it shifted some county costs to the state and provided county ongoing fiscal relief. With cities and special districts, though, the state doesn't have that kind of relationship, so it was very difficult for them to simply absorb a piece of their ongoing costs. So what the state did with cities and special districts, and to some extent with counties as well, is shifted property taxes from schools that otherwise would have gone to schools and shifted it to cities, to special districts, and also to some extent to counties. And then it backfilled schools with increased state aid. All right, so that was the fiscal relief that it provided cities, counties, and special districts. The other challenge that the legislature faced is it had to invent a system for allocating the property tax. Prior to Proposition 13, the allocation of the property tax depended upon where the assessed valuation was and that local agency's tax rate. And now the voters of California had told the legislature it was to be allocated in accordance to law. So the legislature had to figure out how to divvy up the 1% property tax and divvy it up amongst the thousands of units of local government throughout the California. And it was very difficult because our county services varied. Again, Trinity has a large amount of responsibility for municipal services. Orange County has few. Some of our cities provide fire, some do not. Some provide libraries, some do not. So it was impossible to figure out a single allocation mechanism to provide to divvy up the property tax for each local government. So the legislature basically created a system that looked at the 3 years prior to Proposition 13 and prorated the property taxes based on relative shares of the property tax during the 3 years prior to Proposition 13. So as a result, if you had a city that had a relatively high property tax rate and lots of property values during the 3 years prior to Proposition 13, probably to this day you get a larger share of the property tax than your city that had lower property values and lower property tax rate. To a very significant extent, the ABA property tax allocation systems grandfathered into place those property taxation decisions of the mid-1970s. If you turn to the next page, we'll go a little bit further along on this road. We swirl all the way on over to here, and we start to come on back, and now we're in 1991. 1991 was a very difficult year for the legislature. We had a mounting financial problems. And at the same time, there was some interest by some groups, particularly the mental health community, in figuring out a way that there could be greater local control over mental health services. There was a sense that locally they could innovate and use the program dollars more effectively, and if they had more secure revenues, they could get greater outcomes. So there was interest in doing some form of program shift for principally the mental health, but also some public health and indigent health programs, and to shift that program responsibility to counties, giving counties greater funding and significantly greater program authority. And the legislature worked with counties to create a program realignment of that nature, where there was a very significant transfer of program responsibility and authority to counties. The legislature at the time also modified some cost-sharing relationships on a variety of programs. And in these cases, there was not significant program change or program authority change, but there was a modification, you can see in the first column, of what the prior law state-county cost shares were. And then if you move over on the right side, you'll see the realignment cost shares. There was some minor changes to cost-sharing relationships. This and the transferred program got bundled together and is now known as the 1991 Realignment Plan. We bundled these programs together, shifted them to counties, along with a half-cent increase in the sales tax and some modifications to the vehicle license fee depreciation schedule. These programs continue to be administered at the county level. Generally, when people take a look at these programs, they'd say that there were largely successful outcomes, particularly in the mental health side, and that's because they were given some greater authority of the program and they got greater stability in terms of the funding. In terms of the cost-sharing ratio changes, for the most part, those were not significant program changes, and they didn't effectively make major changes in terms of state-local relationships. There was one area, though, that has caused significant ongoing friction forever after. And if you look in the middle of the health item, you'll see in-home supportive services. And you'll see that prior law was the state had paid 97%, and then under realignment, the state provided only 65%. This is a case where it is believed that the county's authority of the program is not very large, and that it is very difficult for counties to control the cost, and so you oftentimes see friction between the state and the county because they have a larger share of a program which costs have increased substantially, and the counties do not have significant authority to reduce the cost. Then on the next page, we're going further along on the swirling road, all the way on down to 2004. Proposition 1A of 2004 came after the notorious ERAF shifts, where the legislature modified the property tax allocations, and many other actions between local government and state government that caused quite a great deal of friction. So you'll see that the first 3 check boxes on page 7 are areas where Proposition 1A, which was sponsored by local governments, but also had the support of the legislature and also the governor. These are areas where the legislature's authority over local finance is constrained. There is significant constraints on the legislature's authority to permanently shift the property taxes or make modifications to the allocation of the sales tax, or to reduce the vehicle license fee below the 0.65 rate. Notice that the legislature's authority is significantly constrained, but there is no increase at the local level. So there's no increased local authority over the property tax or the sales tax or the vehicle license fee, but the legislature's authority is significantly constrained. The last item of Proposition 1A, which oftentimes doesn't get as much mention as I think it deserves, are the mandated provisions, the mandate provisions regarding Proposition 1A. And Proposition 1A said three things that are important regarding mandates. First, it expanded the definition of what is a state reimbursable mandate. And it specified that shifting shares of a program's cost between the state and the county, if it's a required program, that change in the program's cost, giving a greater share of the cost to the county, would represent a state reimbursable mandate. The other thing is it said that the legislature needs to provide funding for all recent bills for a mandate if it wants to continue the mandate in the budget year. Now, that doesn't apply to education mandates, and there's also an employee relations mandate that is excluded. But for the most part, when we talk about the AB 3632 program or the open meetings mandate or many other mandates, you'll hear us say this is the minimum amount of funding that you have to provide in order to keep this mandate alive. And that all stems from Proposition 1A. And the minimum amount of funding is all the bills that are due and payable sitting over in the State Controller's office that are 2004 and later. And the very last provision of Proposition 1A associated with mandates is it said that bills from before 2004, the large backlog of mandates, the legislature could pay those over time. And in terms of non-education local government mandates, the states owes over $750 million. So that ability to pay that over time is a significant fiscal relief. If you turn to the next page, on page 8, frequently during good economic times and bad economic times, there is some interest in realignment. There's some interest is, gee, could we shift the way we have programs between cities, counties, and the state, and can we realign things in some way to get better program outcomes or better accountability or more innovation or more efficiency? And this year is no different. And I just wanted to point out to you some of the considerations that our office has historically mentioned relating to realignment. First off, we think it makes sense to periodically sort out which program makes the most sense at which level of government. And over time, a program may make more sense at a city level or a county level or the state level, and periodically thinking about it makes sense. But the second bullet is important, that programs, good program outcomes, should be the focus of the conversation and not taxes. What you really want to do is design the programs to get the best results for Californians. The next is realignment plans are not easily changed. That's been true for many years, but is even more true now under Proposition 1A and also the variety of federal MOEs. Once you make these kinds of program changes, it's difficult to make modifications, so the details matter. If you're going to shift a program with an idea that you're going to get better program outcomes and more innovation and more responsiveness, you need to sort through how much control you can give the county over the realigned program. If it's a program where you really want uniformity, you really want state accountability, and you don't want variation, it's probably not a good program to realign to the counties or to the city. If it's a program where you think innovation, responsiveness to local needs and preferences is important, that may be a very good program to realign to local government. Roughly match revenues and expenditures, unless this is a program that you want to reduce its ongoing program cost, then you ought to take a look at revenues and the program obligations and roughly match them. And lastly, achieving general consensus will be critical. Program realignment is a very difficult thing to manage. Having a variety of stakeholders who feel that the program is moving in the right direction and are happy with the concept of realignment is very important. And the last page are just some factors to weigh in assigning program responsibilities. I already alluded to the first one. If it's a program where you think statewide uniformity is vital, if statewide benefits are the overriding concern, or if the program really is fundamentally a program where you're trying to redistribute income, it's usually a much more effective to continue to have that program at the state level and control the program at the state level. If it's a program where innovation and responsiveness is more desired, if you want to be able to facilitate citizen involvement in a program or match it with other local programs, that may be a good candidate for realignment to the city or county level. Coordination, you ought to take a look at any kind of program to say, take a look at the other programs that are provided alongside it. If it's a program that has analogous programs that are provided at the county level, then that program also may be better provided at the county level. And then very lastly, that if the state and local government are both going to share a piece of the program's cost, it makes sense that the state's program cost should be roughly commensurate with the state's overall level of control over the program's cost, and that the county's program's cost should be roughly related to their degree of program control. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have regarding this handout or any of the other stops along the yellow brick road.
Mr. Nielsen, you want to share your view of AB8? You're the only other one who was here. You weren't part of that? You don't want to remember that? Okay. Yeah.
There was a great surplus.
Yeah, there's that. All right. Mr. Lowenthal?
Yeah, I have one or two questions on the statement. First, I want to thank you. I love taking this trip along the Yellow Brick Road. I never understand it. And so a few things that I just wanted. The one is, I think it's on, what just really struck me was when you were talking about in AB, I think it was AB 8. No, it was not AB 8. We were talking not AB 8. It was the Proposition 13. That prior to Proposition 13, can you tell me what did it take to pass to raise taxes prior to 13, and what about passing a budget? What was the threshold before?
Statewide budgets.
Statewide.
That would require a 2/3 vote. Proposition 13 did not affect the passage of the budget. What Proposition 13 affected was your ability to raise taxes, and that prior to 13, on the constitutional basis, you could pass a tax on a majority vote.
So prior to 13, the state legislature could raise taxes with a majority vote, but to pass a budget itself needed a 2/3 vote.
Correct.
And I also want to thank you. I think that, obviously we're not on uncharted waters, but we will be, I think, looking at realignment again as we did before. And I think this provides us with some kind of roadmap. Is there anything, if we move forward, that you think you really want to, after providing this, caution us or provide us with some? I think the first day, Assemblymember Nielsen was interested. We talked about that. I think it's in the air. I just want to know what you might want to let us, guide us in this discussion, if this becomes an appropriate way to examine and to look for solutions.
The key factors are mostly in the handout, but I would just reiterate, think about good program outcomes. Which level of government is best situated to getting the kind of program outcomes that you're desiring? Details matter in designing your system. How are you going to be distributing the funds to different local governments is an important consideration. Many of these realignment plans could get very good outcomes, but they also take time to implement and time to manage the transition. So plan with that in mind. But you can get good outcomes through a realignment.
So you're saying this is not a one-year process, even if you begin to really look at this, you may need some to build in successes and to work, but this is not just a one-shot deal.
Some programs are much easier to transition. For example, if you had a small program that is already county administered, but the state is simply in the position of providing funding for that county administered program, you could imagine a realignment where the state provides that county the funds, and the county could be administering that program effectively immediately because it already has the staff, it has the facilities, it has the program. So that's one kind of story. If you're talking about a program where a county needs to be in the position of hiring staff and developing facilities and all the rest, that is somewhat different. There are many different ways that you could manage something like that, though, successfully. And there are programs where, for example, a county might absorb program responsibility in one particular year, but contract back with the state for a year or two in order to manage the transition. There's a variety of ways that you can manage transition. Our caution is making these kinds of changes can take time and really require some thought.
And the final thing is, when you first began, I think it may have been your first or second statement, you said that, well, 48 out of the 50 states have some form of local government, either boroughs, counties, parishes. What two states don't, and how do they deal with it?
48 out of 50 states have a county government. The other two states is Connecticut and Rhode Island. And they don't have county government. They have a geographical area that they call a county, but it's not a county government. And basically, they've placed the responsibilities at the state level and more at the city level. You've got some other states that have something that's called a county, that functions like a county, but in Alaska they call them boroughs, in Louisiana they call them parishes. But that's so 48 out of 50 states have something like a county. Almost every state has something like a city, but in Hawaii, they don't have anything smaller than a county. They don't have cities and they don't have...
So when I'm flying to Honolulu, it's all an illusion.
It's a county responsibility.
Thank you.
Mr. Leno and then Mr. Nielsen.
Thank you for the presentation. Always fascinating and always well done. I think the two-thirds threshold for the passage of the budget came out of Depression-era legislation, out of concern that in the Deep Depression, the legislature should have some restraints in growing its budget. So there was a 5% growth trigger, that if it grew by more than 5% in a year, that would trigger the two-thirds threshold. And that got put into the state constitution in the mid-'60s because the state was growing by more than 5% every year, because those were our golden years and we were growing fast. So that got put into the constitution mid-'60s or so. And I think Senator Walters had a bill that proposed that we would reinstate that 5% trigger for the two-thirds. With regard to AB 8, the county program costs and the tax shift, when the state assumed responsibility for $1 billion of county costs, that $1 billion was not what is that $1 billion worth today? So it grows due to population and inflation, costs of living?
Well, I mean, I guess to properly do it, it was a particular share of the overall program's cost. So you'd have to take a look at, and that was at that time it was AFDC, so you'd have to figure out.
Sure. The dollar figure is not important.
Yeah, it'd be a lot bigger.
And the reason for the legislature doing that was to compensate the locals for their loss of property tax.
Overall, the property tax rate immediately before Proposition 13 was something in the range of about 2.7%. So from going from about 2.7% to 1% was an enormous loss of revenue for local government, and the legislature wanted
And then
to
I would
respond.
imagine the same for the tax shift, which directed county auditors to reallocate some property taxes from schools to cities and counties and special districts. And then the state backfilled
Schools.
the schools. So again, another burden on the general fund in addition to the $1 billion in the other item.
The state absorbed some ongoing spending obligations, increased health and social services cost and increased education cost. as part of AB8. And unfortunately at that time or fortunately at that time it had a fairly large surplus, but that surplus was quickly depleted.
And now, with over 30 years of hindsight, can we say with any certainty that those two components of AB8 are sustainable? Can our general fund sustain that? Or the reason I ask is that part of our problem today?
That would be a hard one to answer. I mean, it's been quite a number of years to say which component of the overall state's general fund is presenting the most problems. Certainly, our obligations on the health and social services programs and for education are part of our overall state fiscal difficulties, but whether it was the ABA component or the trial court component or many of the other actions we've taken over the years.
It's a long and winding road.
It's a long and winding road. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Nielsen?
Well, I'll note that long, windy road begins with SB 90. And keep in mind, SB 90, one of the provisions was if state mandates, state pays. Then the state later came along with the SB 90 disclaimer, which was a beautiful way of saying, well, we just don't owe it, rhetorically. And that's become an issue over the decades. I just observe on realignment. There's a lot of merit in realignment, and AB8 did some realignment. Many things have been realignment along the way, including the trial court funding. I'm very familiar with that debate at the time. But as we go down this road of realignment, it's something that has to be done very carefully and over a long period of time, and with a great cognizance of the impacts on local government. Very often, realignment simply means shifting state burdens to local government. I argue in the corrections area right now, the realignment, so to speak, suggested does a whole lot of that, with even some greater potential for negative things in the future. But realignment without sources of funding is hugely problematic, and key in all of it is mandates. I had a conversation just the other day about this, that I'm kind of a realignment person. I think government closer to the people is always better government. But as the state shifts its burdens to local governments, there are a plethora of mandates that come along for the ride. And these are oppressive and very destructive and very harmful. So as we move into any areas of realignment, linked to that has got to be, if the mandate's not funded, it becomes optional for local government. That's just a fundamental point that I will dwell on. So often the state has just punted its problems to local government. I would say that the trial court funding was kind of an exception at the time. There was something called commitment to the counties at the time. It was 0.5% of the sales tax, which just did not happen. A repeal or modification of 75 mandates that I carried and got massacred because counties wouldn't even support it and let me complain just a bit. I called them hypocrites because they always said they hated mandates, and we gave them a chance to get rid of them, and they did not support that. They love the mandates. A lot of counties love mandates, folks. And that's a whole other story. The bigger the county, the more they love the mandates, but that's another point in time. I am sensitive to big and small and medium counties, but my fundamental point in this is we can contemplate any kind of realignment, which discussion I'm happy to embrace, but we must consider the long-term impacts on local government and the impacts contained therein of the multiples of mandates. And we have to get into the mandate tangle if we're going to get into the realignment tangle.
Yeah, I think the big question there, and I'll go to Senator Dutton, is only how do you think about, how do we give people program without mandates? In other words, how do you get back to where cities run a city program and city gets X money that they know goes with that program, that they both get the money and they get to spend it. And the tangle that this map shows is that it is so tangled between who gets the money and who gives the money and who runs the program, and we end up I guess it's how do you define what your expectations are without creating a mandate is kind of the eternal dilemma. Senator Dutton?
Well, I think that answer to that question to me would be, obviously, it depends on what you consider state's role and city's role and county's role. And I think sometimes we have a tendency to get too involved in things that are best left at the local level, and we probably try to do too many things for too many people. I was around back in 1978 when all this was happening, not up here, but I remember being one of the troops out in the community. And the big challenge that I saw back then, what really drove this, is that you literally had people being taxed out of their homes, because the process of which they went about trying to assess property taxes back in those days is that it didn't really too much matter what the property value was. They'd establish an assessed valuation, but then they would adjust the mill levy rate to whatever they needed in the way of money. And there wasn't any kind of logic or anything as to how they would establish that, other than what the county felt they needed to provide certain levels of service. So consequently, after a while, you had people literally being property taxed out of their homes, and that's what kind of led to that revolt. But I think it's interesting when you look at this, you can't keep just blaming that, because later on, 5 years later, you had the Mello-Roos Community Facilities District that came around, and areas in my area that were about to experience a tremendous amount of housing growth and things like this. It was very common practice for a property developer to have 1,000 acres or whatever. It was a property owner driven election. And so you had one owner of the property. They go ahead and elect to put in a Mello-Roos. And so you look at situations now, it's changed back from what it was in 78. Well, you do have homes that were built after 1978. When you take a look, I've seen them as high as 2.5–3% today. So you can't just go back and say 78, because there was things that came into play that made a difference that did actually bring the money and kept it at the local level, though. And so it does get extremely complex when we start taking a look at trying to you take one part of this out of sequence. Yeah, by itself it looks evil, creates a challenge. But you got to really take a look at the totality of everything that's happened since then, because it all kind of affects each other and adjusts one another. So interesting trip down the yellow brick road, though. Thank you.
Well, I think the thing with it is that most of these things were, in fact, reactions to that, and then we've created all these, it's like doing triple flips to get around the problem. You do Mello-Roos, and Oaks schools feel they've got left out and they got ripped off in the AB8 property tax allocation, so you do 98. Then you have everybody else going, oh my gosh, schools are getting too much, and ERAF got it, so now we want 1A, and now we need the VLF dedicated to us. And in other words, a lot of these have piled on each other in a way that I don't even know how to untangle. It's like you pull one thread, it's like the cat with the ball of yarn. You can't pull one throat out without undoing several of them. And so then the question is, how do you relook at who really has which money, what services really belong with which level of government, and how can they provide it? Because we've made everything's got federal money, state money, and local money in it. Everything, and it's run by one level or the other, but mostly by the other levels, not us. But we're mostly on the hook for the money, and most of the restrictions here are on us. I mean, trial court funding was a reaction to ERAF. We shifted money to schools, and then the locals thought they had too much. That was too much, and they needed money back. So then we took over trial court funding to help the counties out, and then we lose our revenue sources. I mean, I just don't know how to think about how to separate them anymore.
But I think then you also need to go back even further than that if you want to take a look. This whole country was based on, a commerce-type structure, okay? And so even the chambers of commerce, well, a lot of times your local government, back in days before incorporation or cities were formed and things, it was the chambers of commerce that actually were, and it was all a matter of setting up trade routes and things. And so what we've done here is that we've kind of forgotten about, trying to create an environment where the economy can expand and grow, and therefore when you do that, then sure, a responsible person is going to want to take some of their benefits and they want to give back to their community, and then you can start providing the services necessary to help people. But we've kind of gotten away from that. And I think one of the big challenges that I see us having is sometimes too big. Sometimes things can get too big and out of control. I've said earlier about trying to find some accountability with some of these agencies or departments, and you can't. You can't get there, and so it may be in some areas, and that's the reason why I'm glad we're having the conversation about doing some realignment, because, I'm not so sure that necessarily we are the right person for some of this, and maybe it's going to have more accountability if it's done in a more localized level. I just, certainly.
The trick is, how do you get, it goes back to this other question, how do you get the localized level of accountability when the locals don't have the revenue authority and they don't have, and we set the rules? I mean, or we, how do we? Well, some, but yeah, but we get to allocate the property tax. I mean,
They do have revenue authorities. They've got the Community Facilities District. They've got there's a whole bunch of things that they can do, and they also have their own. They get their piece of sales tax. They also, the vehicle licensing fee. I mean, you got a lot of different options there too.
Yeah, they seem to have a lot more of them than we do, is my view. But somebody else, Ms. Conway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I might, I think the having had a foot in both worlds now.
Yeah.
The real issue, and please don't mistake what I'm going to say for saying that we don't pay enough taxes, because that's not what I'm saying. But I think the general public would tell you, I think they've shown us that they're just frustrated because they feel that they're paying a fair amount and what they can pay, and they're paying for things that they never envisioned that their tax dollar should provide. It's out of control. In other words, if you ask people, no matter what government or layer of government is, it's coming from the same person, the taxpayer, whether he's paying it in a property tax or a sales tax or a state tax or a federal tax. It's the same guy that's paying for all of that stuff. And people basically agree, I think, that they're not saying government is bad. And the main expectations from the taxpayers that I talk to are a safe community, whether that's police, fire, it might even be hospital, whatever. They want safety. Everybody wants that. Education is very important. What do people do when they move to a community or when they get to a point where they have children? So where are the good schools? So education is important, and certainly infrastructure. Whether that's roads, buildings, whatever serves us. That's pretty much the base, I think, of what taxpayers say, well, this is good and I want this. But unfortunately now there's a whole lot of other things for a whole lot of other people being supported by those same taxpayers that they may not necessarily think is great and is good. And I think the tolerance level is a little bit, okay, I don't really have that in my community, but I guess it's a good thing. But it's just expanded so much that it's a real frustrating level, at least to the good citizens that I talk to, because all honor, praise, and glory to the taxpayers. They get up every morning, they go to work, if they have a job. They go to work, they pay their taxes, they take care of their family, for the most part. They worship at their place of choice. They volunteer. I think citizens are great. They want to volunteer. They want to be helpful. They give to charity, maybe not as much as they used to, because they choose between what's important to their family and how much they're able to donate to others that need help. And it's very frustrating. It's been frustrating for myself as a quote-unquote elected representative, whether it was on a county board of supervisors or now serving here, is how do you meet the real needs, how do you meet the expectations of the people that you represent in a way that, quote-unquote, I guess is fair. I have a friend, Marty Lansky. He tells me that the sign of a good elected representative is letting your constituents down at a level that they can handle and still like you. Mr. Lansky's probably on to something there, but I don't know that I had a point to that. It's just some general thoughts I have from coming from a board of supervisors. I know, Senator Leno, you had the same experience, although our boards were maybe a little bit different in thought and makeup. And then
of that unique county city role.
Yes. I used to say when I was president of CSAC, hello, we're counties, we're alike different. From Alpine, that doesn't even have a city, to the nation of LA with 10 million people in a county. So difficult to meet everybody's needs.
Yeah, I think people do expect, but the problem is they do expect public safety. They want a road to drive their kids to school on. They want a library and a park for their kids to play in after school. They want public safety. They want, I mean, all of the, and frankly, 90% of all our government dollars, that's all they do. So then the question is, how do we get folks to appreciate that that is what their dollars are doing? I mean, as a city, they have some appreciation that most of it goes to police and fire and libraries and parks and things that are tangible in their community. And you have communities like San Diego that, give you free, waste disposal services. Some cities don't do that. And water hookup. Everybody wants to have water when they turn on the faucet. Everybody wants it to be drinkable water. Everybody wants clean water. Everybody wants a sewer to work. I mean, all of those things are government functions, and they're paid for it different ways. And then they want a court when they need one. They want all of the things that we do. And most folks will acknowledge that there ought to be a safety net, a social safety net, for families who need to get new jobs, to find work, to not be homeless, to have medical care in protection of the community. And so then that's all there is. And I think we've lost the connection because people don't know what we do or what each level does.
But I think in these economic times, then my constituent looks at the last few things you mentioned, even though they may be well-intentioned, as the giveaway programs that have expanded in their mind. Maybe not in anybody else's view, but at least
but not in reality,
where I'm at,
as opposed to,
because they see a lot of the expansion of, let's call them health and social welfare programs, for lack of a better word, and that's frustrating to them.
Yeah, I don't know that
I'm not
it's an
saying the
accurate
basics
view of the
are-
world,
it's the
but
expansion.
it may be a view, but some of it isn't accurate. CalWorks is cheaper than it was when AFDC was realigned in 1972. Mr. Lowenthal? Ms. Skinner.
I also served in local government for a good number of years, and I share Mr. Nielsen's perspective, and probably, I think, Connie, some of our other members on the dais, that there's a number of the services that we provide or that the state is responsible for that are better handled on the local level, just because the nature of the different populations we're a very big state. We're a complex state. We have a lot of differences in our different geographic areas, and so I'm a fan of more decentralization. And I don't know what kind of proposals we may actually be considering. My only difficulty right now is that to move responsibilities at this point to local government without providing them the funding to do so is a very unfair burden. And I'm not saying that this is what some people's motivation is, but without either giving local governments more ability to raise revenues themselves so that they can actually fund the programs, or without our raising some revenues so that we have adequate funds where we could then pass the responsibility on, but also funds. Because the difficulty we're facing right now with this deficit is that we don't have adequate revenues, whether it's local government or us, to do some of these programs. This book is full of areas of need, or areas where either local governments, if you look at least in my office, all the local governments are saying, don't cut this, right? And because they already either have that burden or they have a population in need, and they're nervous that if we cut it, even if we don't pass the responsibility on, in effect, they have it because the population is still in need. So that's the conundrum I face, at least, and I think that many of us face in trying to reconcile this. I would I'm very supportive of devolving those powers, but I think we also have to give the locals more ability to enable themselves, if needed, to have the revenue to do so.
Senator Lowenthal?
Yeah. I just wonder, and I don't know if can be answered, if you could give us an example of a realignment that didn't work, that where we had thought that might work, it was proposed, and really did not reach the objectives that it really was supposed to reach. Because, as you say, this should not be done just for fiscal purposes. You're really saying it really should be done primarily for programmatic purposes, going back to really what Senator Dutton said. Where's the best place to deliver these services, and where hasn't it worked where we've done that?
I'd like to chat with my colleagues on that and get back with you with a good example.
As we're beginning to think about it, it'd be nice to understand where we've had some issues around that in the past.
Yeah, I'll get back with you.
Thank you.
One other, if you're coming back to, do you have any thoughts about which, from these lists and stuff, of which might be candidates for timely consideration?
That's right.
When I get back regarding the programs that don't work, I can also provide you a long list of programs along with the references where we've made recommendations that we do think it could work. We've made particular recommendations regarding parole and juvenile justice and child care and a variety of other areas. So I'd be happy to come back with a list of if we can come up with examples of what hasn't worked, and nothing comes to my mind right away, but let me chat with my colleagues.
Madam
and
Chair.
Also a list of recommendations we've made in the past.
Yeah, Mr. Fuente?
I think that'd be very helpful to us to see what, from your perspective, is options for us to consider. But I think what would also be helpful, in that chart that I'm kind of seeing in my head now, if you could also tell us where some of the hamstrings are, because I imagine that there are some federal reporting in some areas, probably the mandate question, what level of funding we would have to include. So if we could sort of prioritize a queue of options to help reflect the potential, issues that would have to be worked out in order to make that successful, I think that would be really helpful, because I think that also helps us understand sort of what's the art of the possible here, because there might be some workforce issues or some funding issues or some federal regulatory issues.
How we get complicated. Feds make regulations and mandate them on the state, and then the state tries to pass the responsibility to the county, but then we're stuck because we have to do a mandate. Mr. Blumenthal?
Yeah, just one more filter on that also that might be helpful, which is, of course, the ones we want to look at first are the ones that actually can save money. So, in terms of priorities, some of these may be great and may be good policy options for the upcoming year. And I know you said that, and I heed the idea that you said, which is this should not be driven by money savings, because it should be driven by good programmatic outcomes. And I agree with that 100%. But in terms of if this group here is going to be considering something, if it's just a policy outcome and it's not saving a lot of money, then that's something that we can more appropriately take on down the road in policy. But if it actually can save money, then it's something we may want to bump up to the top of the list. So that filter would be important.
Very few realignment proposals overall, very obviously in the near term, save money.
But
you can get better outcomes on a program over time, sometimes by realignment. Usually the way realignment works is there's some alternative source of revenues that is raised or is dedicated to that program. So the notion of realignment suddenly forming a budget solution in the near term is really, I'd caution you, is an unrealistic expectation. Unless you were to raise some revenues for a program or reallocate or rededicate or shift some other revenues, some existing revenues to a program. But I don't think there's a very large number of programs by simply from moving them from governance structure A to governance structure B that you're going to be saving money. Hopefully, by shifting the programs over time, you're going to get better outcomes, better accountability, more efficiency.
Well, and you might get, if you think about it over a, let's say, 3 to 5 year window, there may, in fact, be savings as you do it. The juvenile justice stuff that we've already started and that perhaps, hopefully, this year we can continue in a broader way are is an example where the cost of keeping them at the formerly CYA facilities was much greater than the cost of county services. We sent money with the county services, and so, I mean, but it takes more than a year to move X thousand juveniles from place A to place B, or have them, courts not send them where they used to send them, or however those processes work. But you do get savings. You sometimes don't get savings in the first year or two that you do something, but if you design a program and you start it, Medi-Cal, managed care, will take more than a year to get real savings, but it will create savings for the state over a window of time, right?
For example, one of the outcomes associated with the 1991 realignment is that there was greater use of community facilities and community services for people with mental health needs, as opposed to inappropriate hospitalization at the state level. So that did result in reduced cost, but they were realized over time. The notion of realignment is over time you may get greater efficiencies, greater innovation, greater outcomes. But on the natural, it alone is not something that I can come back with a proposal and you can say how much can you score it for the budget year.
No, but we do need to occasionally try to think beyond, tomorrow. And if we're going to get, I mean, the state's been in this fiscal mess for more than a year. We need to figure out a plan to get out of it for more than a year. And there is, I mean, at least some of us are real tired of this, lumping from year to year and not kind of trying to look at we're in Chapter 11. We haven't hit Chapter 7 yet, so can we do our Chapter 11 plan, I mean, is there a way for us to think about how we pay and go and get to where we've paid, we've got ourselves back to even, right? But we haven't quite done that yet, and a lot of the scenarios don't quite get there, and maybe we can't get there all in 1 year. But at least we ought to do no more digging for the out years if we can help it. So I don't know how to. So some of these things you could help us not dig the hole deeper in the out years, even if we just start it this year. The effect may not be till 11-12, but if we can keep the 11-12 deficit from being as big as the 10-11 deficit, that would be a positive thing. I mean, right? Anyway, so, Mr. Dutton?
One of the challenges we have, and I think it might have been one of the senators, I think Senator Leno maybe had brought up about, doing some kind of performance evaluation, something like that. And frankly, that's where parts of the problem is, because we theorize that some of these things may be beneficial, but then nobody ever does the actual follow-up to see if it actually is, on a case study basis. And so I'm beginning to really, I think that's where parts of the problems are. I don't think anybody would object that if we could do some kind of a case study where we found that we had, if we do this, we provide a CalWORKS program, we provide all these things that when you follow this person through, that actually they did become, more employable, things like that. Because I'm reminded too, I was, when I was looking at the race for the top, a lot of that was just trying to get the data. And I know Senator Steinberg's had bills too, where we're trying to figure out why the dropout rates, for an example. But you got to be able to track and find out exactly what's happening. And if you don't do the follow through, then you never really know. You're just kind of theorizing. And so, I don't know if there's actually any case studies or things out there that could actually give us some actual data that would show that some of these programs do truly have a benefit, and not just in theory, but in actual application. It would be helpful to me anyway.
I think we probably got some pretty good data on CalWORKS, because there were studies built into the original bill that I know are out there. And that one you can trace caseload improvement. There is a lot of, but I agree, a lot of it's anecdotal. The anecdotal stories are everybody gets a job and everybody goes to work and they don't get back on. And to a large degree, that's been true. And many counties have, an abundance of examples of that. IHSS is a harder one to do that with, and I think there are some where I don't know that there's any way to value outcomes of IHSS. The patient lived an extra 20 years. I don't know how you do that. Or the patient was not, maybe the measure is was not hospitalized, or when could have been, or I don't know, that one's harder to even think about what the measurement is, but I think thinking about some of those things, even if we're planning for something that has to happen next year, to lay out the questions could be, what are the performance measures? We try to do that for schools and say, well, high school graduation rate, that would be a measure, right? But it's harder to do that with something like an in-home supportive services. Patient did not slip and fall, die, or go to hospital. I mean, I don't know,
If you actually adopted the criteria that my colleague mentioned before, that they are at least eligible to go into a nursing home, and they don't, that would be a way to qualify or quantify that the program is working. Right now, we don't know because it's too nebulous. There's too many variables. But it seems like that would help lower it down to where it's more objectifiable and measurable.
Well, that would be the criteria for entry to the program, but the question of whether... Interesting question. I don't know how to think about that. I mean, I don't know how to... But what has happened is the program has been, in fact, from the beginning, offering services beyond that level. So then the question is, is that the appropriate eligibility criteria, which right now is not the criteria. But whether, let's say, at the lower level that the service is offered. Now, in some cases, the service is mandated by the federal, basically by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Anyway, I mean, so there's some other levels of service that are provided in there that have nothing to do with nursing home care, but have to do with disability rights. I mean, regional centers refer people to IHSS, period. And regional center says you get it, because that's the law, right? It's not our law, I think, but I think it is there. I mean, it is federal law. Lanterman Act, too, maybe, to some degree. But we ought to think about some of those. And if you have candidates and, things that are simpler, things that are harder, okay, And I think we've asked folks to work on some of these issues as we've come to them. And I think the corrections question, I mean, the governor did create some unfunded realignments in this budget. And I think, we've looked at those and said maybe we can do them differently and more effectively. Things like the corrections, the DJJ that's already kind of half a work in progress, has taken more than 2 years, but I think we are starting to see results. So, some of those have some possibilities for moving forward. Ms. Conway?
Madam Chair, I appreciate that, and I'm also curious too. I mean, I'm always interested in, and it's probably not, ROI is not probably the right definition, return on investment, but if you can have $1 million program and it can be highly successful and it maybe served 10 people and it was highly successful. So sometimes I'm also curious that we spent X amount of money and it was a great outcome, but a great outcome for how many? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, caseload matters. And we ought to, I mean, if people don't have that data, we should. Some of us are, the folks who sit on those appropriate subcommittees are more inured to that data than some others, Mr. Lenos. But why don't we get that around to folks if we don't have it, whatever the LAO has. And I know some of the folks in the audience have some of those data and some of those studies. So without overwhelming us with volumes, we could try to get some of that around. All right. If that covers what people think there, why don't you stay there for a moment? I think we might as well, while we're still in this local government frame of mind,
Let's go to revenues. We're here to praise Caesar or bury Caesar today.
Marianne, why don't we jump, since you're here, and I suspect this is you too, to the Brown Act issue, or not. We have another head. Members, it sort of jumps in our agenda to page 11, but it sticks to the same theme, and while we're here, we might as well hear it. And there is another LAO handout, and so we might as well stay in the local government arena while we're in the local government arena, because this is a perfect example of something we might be able to do. The Senate tried to do something the LAO suggested, and if the rest of you haven't heard this, I think the presentation is helpful on this one. And it goes to sort of the same things we were just talking about on the charts and different ways of doing things. It's a little sensitive, but it's hugely timely. Sorry if you didn't brief on that.
The handout that I'll be working for is called the Open Meeting Act Mandate Handout. Okay. And if you turn to the first page of it, you should know that the core provisions of the Brown Act, the core provisions date to the 1950s. And most of those provisions, because it dates from the 1950s, they predate all of mandate law. So they are not state reimbursable mandates. So the vast majority of the Brown Act is not a state reimbursable mandate. What is a mandate is some subsequent actions by the legislature that have imposed some procedural requirements on local government regarding posting their agenda and telling the public what they're going to discuss when they go into a closed session, and then coming back to their public after the closed session and describing the content of what the matter that they were discussing in closed session. If you turn to page 2 of it, of the handout, it summarized some of the provisions that are not part of the mandate. They are part of the Brown Act, but they're not part of the state reimbursable mandate. So the obligations that local governments vote in public, that they meet in their local jurisdiction in an accessible facility, that they allow the public to talk, that their records are open to the public, that you can get a recording of the materials. All of that predates and the provisions of law that imposed a state reimbursable mandate. They are not something that the state pays for. This is all local government duties. They are not part of the state reimbursable mandate. If you turn to page 3, it identifies the provisions of law that have been determined to be a state reimbursable mandate. And that is the requirement that a local government come up with a brief agenda with about 20 words per item, and that they post it 3 days before the hearing, and that they go before the closed session and after the closed session to telling the public the general content of what they're going to be discussing in the closed session. If you turn to page 4, it talks about what is reimbursable, and now we're getting down to the specific elements of reimbursability. This is the agenda preparation, because the Commission on State Mandates determined that in order to post an agenda, you had to have an agenda. Okay, so the agenda preparation costs are state reimbursable. The posting it, that's reimbursable. The coming back afterwards, after the closed session, it's reimbursable. And also a little bit of training for your local officials in order to carry out this mandate, that's all reimbursable. If you turn to page 5, it goes over what are some of the mandate costs. And now this mandate, it had some legal issues, and so for a little while we were not getting the bills. But if you look over the course of history of this mandate, you end up basically seeing something in excess of $20 million. About $17 million from the non-EDGE side, and the last date I had was about $6 million for K-14 districts. This year, there's only a very small amount that is currently due and payable, and that was because of some of the legal challenges that were going on very recently. But the overall cost of this mandate is in excess of $20 million a year. In order to give some sort of a flavor of what these claims look like, I had the State Controller's Office pull 3 claims and just summarize them there. The County of Santa Barbara, they had 384 meetings. So these are Board of Supervisors meetings and also some smaller meetings. And they claimed $78,000. And for all the short agendas, they claim a flat rate. And in that year, 2005, the flat rate was $134 an agenda. For 41 meetings, they had long agendas, and so they claimed 30 minutes of staff time at a $44.60 hourly rate for each item on the agenda. Okay? The City of Vista had 109 meetings, And they did the same thing. The short agendas, you get the flat rate, and then the long agendas, you figure out what your hourly costs are, and you count up all the items on the agenda, and you multiply it by that, and you submit your claim. Mesa Consolidated Water District, they did the same thing. They, the flat rate then, because now we're dealing with 2008-9 data, the flat rate is now $155 per agenda, and the district claimed for their long agendas, they claimed 33 minutes of staff time at $75.21 an hourly rate for each item on all the other, on their lower length agendas. The reason that their hourly rate is so much bigger than Santa Barbara's and Vista's is Mesa Consolidated Water District includes some costs for the general manager who makes over $200,000 a year. And so that cost is built in to the mandate reimbursement. Our general sense of this mandate is that the cost of local government operations, their own agenda preparation, ideally ought to be borne by the local government. If you turn to the next page, we have the administration's proposal. They're proposing in the May revision suspending the mandate. And now when you suspend a mandate, you still have in the government code all the provisions of the Brown Act, and they don't look any different, okay? You don't make any changes to that. But if you pull up the budget then, you'd see an item that says that the Open Meeting Act has been suspended. And then you'd have to go to the Commission on State Mandates to basically look at the decision, and then it would say that agenda prep and posting has been suspended. And that's how a resident would know that this provision has been suspended for the course of one fiscal year. It's not the most transparent process, okay? But when you suspend a mandate, you don't incur costs for the next year. You don't incur costs for the year because it becomes optional for local government whether or not to comply to it. Our sense of the administration's proposal, it'll be highly confusing to the public as to what is the obligation on local government. It also sends local government the wrong signals as to what their obligations are to their local residents. And this is particularly true because Prop 59 of 2004 broadly entitles local residents to access to their public decision-making bodies. And so you could almost read Prop 59 as also requiring agenda postings. If you turn to page 7, you get to the LAO recommendation regarding this mandate. Our recommendation is that you go back into the government code and you amend these provisions relating to posting of the agenda and telling the public what they're going to, what you've done in closed session. You amend them to recast them as best practices. Okay, they're best practices for implementing Proposition 59. Then you turn around and you require each local government to, at a regularly scheduled public hearing, to tell their residents how they're going to comply with the spirit and the requirements of Proposition 59. Just tell their public how they're going to comply. Are they going to comply with the best practices, or are they going to be doing something else? Because it's going to be done at a regularly scheduled public hearing. Simply the announcement about how they're going to be following law would not be a mandate. If a local government opted not to follow the best practices, we would require them simply to notify the state, perhaps the state attorney general, some entity of the state, and which would have a responsibility of posting a list of local governments that are not following the best practices, but they're going to follow some other practices. So that would allow the public to know which local governments are following the best practices and which ones are not. This recasting of the mandate into being best practices would eliminate the state's ongoing costs associated with this measure without creating a new mandate. It would have local governments tell their own residents how they're going to comply with the spirit of Proposition 59 and with the ongoing requirements of the Brown Act. In terms of the assessment of the LAO alternative, it's one of its strengths is it reduces your ongoing costs by over $20 million a year. It is also a permanent change, unlike the administration's proposal, which is on a year-to-year basis. It is also transparent. You would have local governments telling their local residents how they're going to comply with the spirit of Proposition 59. On the limitation side, there is a potential for some reduced uniformity in local agency agenda posting and closed session policies. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Do you have any sense, so just to say some city decided it didn't want to have any procedures, would there then be authority for the DA or the Attorney General or some private party to sue them under Prop 59? I mean, given that we've gotten rid of all the other, you know what I mean? Somebody has to have, they could have authority to enforce under Prop 59, I guess is what I'm, in some fashion.
There are broad provisions that are not part of the mandate, a part of Open Meeting Act. So they would still have the authority to require the local government to share any public documents or share any materials. But in terms of a local government saying we're not going to have any kind of policy for providing access to what our agenda item is.
Yeah, would that be like a
I think
violation?
it would be very difficult to have that with the requirements of Prop 59. Prop 59 of 2004 says the people have the right of access to information concerning the conduct of people's business. And therefore, the meetings of public bodies and the writings of public officials and agencies shall be open to public scrutiny. It would be difficult to then say we're not going to have any...
It would be difficult to stay elected if you didn't post agendas, I suppose. But there's that side to it, too. Mr. Blumenfield first, and then Senator Mr. Nielsen.
Yeah, I'm just technically trying to figure out how requiring each local government to announce its policies and requiring the government to notify the state about not following the practices, how that's not itself a mandate. Or would it be and just less expensive?
The voters have approved Proposition 59. Okay? Actions that the legislature takes that are necessary simply to implement Proposition 59 are not a mandate. So all you'd be saying is at a regularly scheduled public meeting, tell your residents how you're going to comply with Proposition 59. And that would be just a portion of their regularly scheduled meeting, and it would be necessary to implement Proposition 59. We're not asking them to develop detailed policies and send them to the state, and then simply, if you're not going to follow the best practices, simply notify the state. Okay? If a local government's cost associated with a state requirement like that is less than $1,000, they don't have ability to file a mandate claim. And I would think that a local government's cost associated with that would be certainly within the $1,000 threshold.
Okay. And then on the, obviously the concern that everyone's going to have when you start talking about this is how does that deal with sunshine provisions, and are people going to start thinking that we are in some way removing the ability to be transparent? I mean, I guess I see where you're going on it, but what are your feelings about the transparency perception?
You could argue it both ways. You could say by asking local governments to tell their residents how they're going to comply with Proposition 59, you may have a local government that actually provides an enhanced level of public access to decision making. It could go either way. I'd also point out that on page 2, where we listed the provisions of the Open Meeting Act that are not mandates, you still have the public records and recordings provisions of the Brown Act that would continue, that must provide materials upon public request. So that portion of it, all the access to the materials, that would not be affected by our recommendation.
Mr. Nielsen, and then Senator
Maybe a question of finance. Why this mandate? We're spending a lot of time on $20 million here. This is not the most complained about mandate I've heard over the decades from local government. Something like W&I, I believe it's 17,000 general assistance. The county's the last resort. I'd really love to see some relief in that mandate, but I think would result in some much more substantial savings. Why has this one been so prioritized? I'm just curious.
Jeff Carasone, Department.
It's expensive to the state. It may not be a burden, but
Jeff Carasone, Department of Finance. Our policy has been to fund only local law enforcement, property tax, and election mandates related to law enforcement, property tax, and elections. And this didn't fall within that category, and we had to either fund it or suspend it. We chose to suspend it, thinking that Prop 59 would be the overarching requirement, and that the locals would follow the requirement of Prop 59.
Leo just took it one step farther.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I will also add that we are okay with the LEO compromise. We do think that it does a good job of clarifying the relationship between the Open Meetings Act and Prop 59, and it still achieves the same fiscal goals as our proposal.
Well, and then it has the long-term benefit, Mr. Nielsen, of not having to do this every year for the next 20 years. Mr. Leno?
I think this, Ms. O'Malley, you could help just clarify. This gets back to Mr. Blumenfield's concern. I would imagine the decision that is made at the local level, let's say at a city council, they would have to put forward maybe by resolution. It'd probably be a vote of the city council, whatever their policy decision is. So that itself would be sunshined. That would be noticed. There would be public participation in the debate of that policy in a local ordinance or resolution. So there'd be a whole public process around it. So it'd just be an act of government.
Somebody else? Mr. Blumenfield? No.
Yeah, there's another question about the, part of the Brown Act is that you can only have a certain number of members in a meeting. I'm not sure if that's what you're getting to. Is that covered in that first bullet about?
That's not part of the reimbursable mandate.
It's the pre-Brown. I mean, it's the pre-mandate. It comes under the pre-mandate group, right?
I believe it's part of the pre-mandate group.
Yeah, I think that's
However, I'm not certain, but it is not part of the mandate group. Okay, it is not part of the. It's not a state reimbursable mandate. No,
whatever
portions
that would not be affected.
That's correct. The portion that is a mandate is the requirement that you prepare the brief agenda, post it 72 hours before, and that the announcements regarding the closed sessions. That is the mandate that we're talking about.
It's the paying them, Mr. Nielsen's gone, it's the paying them $20 million a year to do what on the natural you'd think everybody would require them to do. That sort of makes you crazy. So even if it is a small one, it is an irritant of the largest sort. But the only concern would be how to make sure that people have an enforceable right to, and I would think that Prop 59, because it's voter approved, would create an enforceable right for people to be able, if some city decides never to tell you what they're doing in closed session anymore, that somebody would have the ability to enforce that right by right of private action or by referral to the DA or the AG or somebody.
I think we tend to agree with you, and also by having the state adopt best practices, then for those people that do have a concern, then the state is on record with what we think the best practices should be for the local government.
So they could sue them and they're violating that statute or having not adopted
because those are guidelines, and so by us giving the guidelines for local government, then it gives citizens an opportunity to understand if they don't think that counties or cities are doing it.
Yeah, no, it's just how students enforce it, I think, is the question that some would have. But Gulf Street can't be any worse than where we are now. Anyway, so we go ahead, Mr. Fuentes.
Quick question. So if a entity were not to, a government structure were not to adopt best practices and they notify the state, what happens then? Do we have any ability, since we've taken the mandate away, to compel them to issue an agenda or do the notice like we otherwise would be able to?
No, because we would be repealing that mandate. Right. We could put public sunshine on them. We could print a list. We could have a web list of the local agencies
who don't employ these best practices.
That's correct.
But by and large, we wouldn't be able to
no. It would no longer be a mandate.
So there'd be less sunshine and transparency if some cities or counties or school districts elected not to follow our best practice model.
That goes to my question. I suspect that the local individual citizen would have a private right of action or ability to refer to the DA for failure to comply with Prop 59. And so there would be an enforceable right. It just wouldn't be the state's purview to do anything about it.
If I may, on the bottom of page 2, I summarize the civil and enforcement and criminal enforcement provisions that are currently available for the Brown Act. And I have not looked at the issue of whether or not they could be modified to be extended to some provisions associated with Proposition 59, but there may be some potential there.
Right. Madam Chair, it might be important to clarify that there is a mandate in Prop 59 on local government. The issue is under the rules of mandates, voter-approved initiatives are not reimbursable by the state. So that's the distinction here.
The trick is that if we're doing it in compliance with Prop 59, which goes back to, I believe people have a right to enforce Prop 59, whether it's a DA or a private right of action or whatever, that there has to be a right to enforce Prop 59. And that's, Mr. Fuentes, where the issue revolves, is the right to enforce Proposition 59. So just as today, the citizen sues the city if they think the city violated the Brown Act, they could sue the city and say you violated Proposition 59. I mean, that, I guess, is at least that's the theory that we would be trying to operate under.
Would there be a way to, if in implementing Prop 59, to add language that would not be a mandate, that would somehow explain that implementation of 59 in today's era includes posting things on the website or on a state website?
I think you could broadly talk about the goals of Proposition 59, but we'd have to be drafted pretty carefully so that we're not mandating the actual action. Suggesting it as a best practice.
But of which they can still ignore if they choose.
Right.
Madam Chair, I have
yes. Sorry. Yeah. Finance, and then Mr. Fuentes. Why don't you
just a quick suggestion, and maybe hate to offer a compromise, but how about if we were to pay what was due this year, the $362, and then ask the Commission for a redetermination on whether this is a reimbursable mandate or not? Would that
6.5 years from now, you'd get an answer. But
we'll be in better fiscal.
Yeah, but we'll owe $20 million a year for each year that we do that. I mean, the Mandates Claims Commission has heard this like 100 times, and you get these. Unfortunately, this goes back to our consistent complaint about the Mandate Claims Commission, but the way it works, every city and county does it different. Everybody charges a different rate, and the examples she gave are classic. I mean, one city will charge you 10 cents to post the thing, and another city will charge you $1,000, and we just have to pay it all.
Has this been heard a million times by the Commission?
At least.
It's been heard more than once, but you're unlikely to get a different result by giving this to the Commission, because they would look at the broad language of Proposition 59, and they would also look at the specific language of the Brown Act and say there's nothing exactly that's in Proposition 59 that references posting an agenda 72 hours before. So you're likely to get the exact same result if you ask them for redetermination.
Yeah, it would be a mandate. The question, if you leave the statute in place that requires the posting, that is a mandate. I think that's pretty much settled. The question is, if we remove it, will local voters be able to hold their local agencies accountable to ensure that they get sufficient notice of meetings in an appropriate fashion and they get sufficient notice of closed sessions? I mean, that's sort of the bottom line. They're still forced to hold the meetings in public. They're still required to do quorums. There's still all of the other things that were in the Brown Act that are not considered a mandate are there. And Prop 59 is there to tell them that, yes, it is our expectation that you will be transparent and So then the question of enforcement of Prop 59, which hasn't probably really come up yet because it's just sort of too new, right? Does anybody know? Ledge Council? No? Yeah.
Yeah. Are we current on these payments?
Oh, no, never.
In terms of the Open Meeting Act, The state owes a little over $400,000 for it. There are large bills that are being tallied up, and they'll be faced before the legislature next year. There was a short period where the legislature thought it had taken an action to address this mandate. It was overturned as unconstitutional. So this mandate is back before you once again.
And so now we'll have to pay for all the years it was theoretically maybe unconstitutional?
That's correct. My hunch is when the state controller's office finishes tallying, we probably can have about a $50 or $60 million bill.
Yeah, yeah. What did we do before, just so we don't do it again?
A few actions. The legislature modified the definition of a mandate in the government code to say if something is reasonably related to a voter-approved measure, it is not a mandate.
It wasn't
and the
clear
legislature also directed the commission to set aside its prior decision. And the court didn't take fondly on either one of those actions.
Okay, that's interesting. Ms. Skinner?
Well, this may not save any money in the current year, but it seems like some kind of conformity around billing would be a worthwhile move to make. Well, it's very difficult to do for this upcoming because most local governments have already, they've already set.
But we don't have the ability to control what they claim. They claim what they claim to the Mandate Claims Commission, and the Mandate Claims Commission pays them. Or we pay them after the Mandate Claims Commission tells us.
Mandate programs on the natural don't have a lot of cost containment mechanisms because the Constitution requires that you reimburse local governments for their cost of carrying out an activity. So if a local government can say our cost because we have...
Why can't we have a conforming cost schedule? All right, Mr. Well, but there's other mandates where we have, we only allow a billing of certain amounts.
There are mandates. Most mandates we reimburse for the local government's actual cost. This mandate has kind of an odd schedule. It's kind of 3 different ways that you can actually file a claim. The flat rate, the blended rate where you figure out your hourly cost,
right.
and your actual cost. It would be very difficult to come back to local governments and enforce a very single reimbursement methodology on this program.
Well, the other issue I was going to make, besides the conformity, which seems like, I don't know, I think it needs to be explored more, is that the Brown Act was written for a paper world. And if we look now at the notices by local government, while there's still, yes, some printing of agendas and such, it's on websites, it's by email, it's electronic. Now, that's not going to save us that huge amount of money because there's still personnel time required to put things up on websites or send emails out and such. But certainly it might trim costs somewhat if written to more acknowledge that we're not any longer in solely a paper world.
The biggest portion of the cost of this mandate is the staff time to prepare the agenda. So you'll have your city manager, your district manager, a variety of other department heads and such. The actual posting of it, whether it be with Thumbtack or actually on the web, that's not the largest portion of the cost. It's more the staff
Okay,
time.
so that part is very confusing to me because the Brown Act doesn't mandate, it mandates the transparency. Right, but wait, posting, right? But the local government has to have an agenda for their meeting whether the Brown Act exists or not. So why we're paying for the development of an agenda? That part seems
okay.
Yeah.
What happens? What happens with mandates is if you have what is something that is viewed as an optional local government activity before.
Well, an agenda is not optional.
I would agree. But
making public the agenda is the thing that's mandated.
Okay. There was no formal state requirement to have an agenda before the Brown Act. And then we went from no formal requirement to have an agenda to posting an agenda, which presupposes development of an agenda, and therefore we owe the cost for development of the agenda.
Finance?
Quick comment. Not to pick on the whole mandate system, but if we went internet or some kind of electronic, if there was one county that didn't have the right computer or servers, we would also be paying
have to
for
pay for
that.
the
That's
county.
that's pretty much how the whole mandates process works. So you could be surprised at the level of cost if we required them to do something that seems simple for us, but if there's one county that doesn't have the proper web servers to make it happen.
Well, tomorrow for broadband so that they can all catch up.
Another way you could revise this is to say, if you prepare an agenda, you shall post it.
All right. If folks need more time to digest this, that's fine. I think we're all on the Senate version. Just we're with the LAO until sued and otherwise found to be non-compliant with something. But I understand it is a complex issue, and there are little signs of danger. But it just the more you hear this one, the crazier it gets. So. But I am happy to move on to get everybody out of here. If we don't have enough votes. Mr. Nielsen left, so I don't know. Whenever somebody wants to come back and vote on this. I'm glad to hear Finances finds that possibility doable, too. So unless Ledge Council comes up with something tells me I can't enforce Prop 59, then I would be inclined.
I'm not aware of any reported cases on it. As you say, it's a pretty new body, so there isn't case law being developed.
Okay. It's fine. You want to leave it open, but as soon as anybody comes up with a way to do it, then just give folks a chance to digest it. All right. Page 12, we've already talked about AB 3632, beyond our capacity for tolerance. Page 13, we will talk about it again, but just not 2 days in a row.
We're going to go back to the other page?
We will. But I was just trying to get through the local government section, and then we'll go back to the beginning again. But if this stuff all has to just stay open, it is what it is. When whatever page you want to talk about. The next 3 pages are all related to the larger assembly proposal that can be talked about at Bottle Bills or at Oil or at any number of other locations. So let's just, all of these are open. Right, so they all stay open. There's nothing, right? Until you're, yeah, but they're all your stuff. They're all just your thing. They're all part of your proposal, your big proposal in the sky. So that, I think, takes us back to the beginning of this agenda, which is the Board of Equalization issues. See if we can get through these 10 pages or so relatively quickly. All right. Page 1, Board of Equalization. This was finance proposal? Finance?
Chris Hill, Department of Finance. The administration proposed to BCP to expand this program to 3 additional border stations. That was approved by both houses. However, the Assembly approved the positions as 2-year limited term, and the administration supports the Senate action approving the positions as permanent because this program has proven itself to be successful, and we can believe it will continue to generate the revenues.
Programs that bring in money and do wonderful, good public service like having the ag inspection and keeping pests out, which is also saving money, are good things. Mr. Lowenthal moves the Senate version. Is there any objection? Hearing none. 4-0 on the Assembly side, 4-0 on the Senate side, subject to add-on by absent parties. Page 2, sales tax collection on internet retailers. Elio?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michael Cohn with the Analyst's Office. Really, page 2 and 3 are connected issues. They deal with the use tax collection, which is sort of akin to the sales tax for purchases made on the internet or through catalog. It's a difficult issue, about $1 billion of uncollected money. certainly recommend on page 3 adopting the Senate action, which is keeping the
these are related members.
The use tax line on the income tax form. So those people who wish to declare that they owe use tax have a very convenient way, and it does bring in $9 million. On page 2, the issue is a little bit more difficult. I think members have been struggling over the last couple of years on how to best collect this money, and frankly, I don't think we've really settled on a particularly great idea that we are confident could stand up in court. New York's tried one model. What the Senate did on page 2 is more the Colorado model of requiring
paper them to
basically the retailers to send BOE all of the information on California purchases, which does raise some administrative issues as well as potentially some privacy issues of the State Board of Equalization getting all of this information about what residents receive. So we'd recommend you go with the Senate version on page 3, the use tax line, and on page 2 you might be better off leaving this to the policy committee process. There is a bill, AB 2078, out there by Assemblymember Calderon that's passed the Assembly, that's now in the Senate. And as I said, there are some difficult issues here that might be better served in a policy committee context.
Ms. Skinner?
Your comments focused on the Colorado model, and as you rightfully indicate, the Colorado model really doesn't give the state really much better ability to collect the sales tax that's rightfully owed, other than getting now a list of people who bought products on such sites for the state then to try to, in effect, go after to collect, which is an increase in state costs, obviously. So, I don't know how you could score any revenue on it, because I think if the staff time that would be needed to chase any individual, would probably negate any revenue that would be brought in. There is the New York model, which has also been enacted by Rhode Island and by, let's see, there was at least one other state.
And by the Senate here earlier this year.
Yes, and by the Senate. North Carolina, Rhode Island, North Carolina, and New York, which basically establishes the nexus which enables the state to collect the sales tax it's rightfully owed and doesn't leave it just to the purchaser via the use tax. Now, interestingly enough, now we have more and more of our retailers, our brick-and-mortar retailers, who are in effect asking us to respond and to enact something like this because of the unfair playing field that's now been created, where some retailers are able to sell and not collect the sales tax, whereas a huge percent are. The California Chamber of Commerce now had an opposition to the New York model and has now pulled that opposition. The California Retailer Association is supporting the New York model. And the California Retailers Association includes companies such as 7-Eleven, Safeway, who, by the way, is the largest employer in the state of California, CVS Pharmacies, Home Depot, Walgreens, Target, other companies that are encouraging California now to adopt the New York model are Best Buy, the Irvine Company, Barnes & Noble, J.C. Penney, the California Business Properties Association, and the New York model is estimated at bringing in at least $300 million a year to California, and I think it's worthy of our consideration.
Finance, do you have? I mean, I think actually the Senate had supported the New York model last year, this year. We had heard some concerns by some folks about that one, and that's part of the reason we've tried. Since that one hadn't passed the other house, we figured we'd try Colorado. but we are kind of happy to collect this however we best can collect it. Does anybody have an update? I had heard that the New York appellate case might be decided this month, which would help us all a lot. I mean, we were basing on the New York trial court decision favored New York. We got a lot of pushback last year from small direct sellers, but the big direct sellers are now weighing in rather substantially. They did at subcommittee, and the list that Ms. Skinner just read is there. Finance, do you have any new opinions on this?
No, I think the administration still doesn't support either model at this point. Both of them are subject to some considerable legal concerns, plus there's the potential for retaliation by the various affected businesses. In some states, Amazon has pulled their business relationships with the companies that then create the nexus, and that's injured those businesses. So there's a potential for California in-state businesses to lose revenues and lose business because of the various tactics that are being played out around these.
Does anybody know, did that I've heard varying answers to this, so if somebody doesn't have it right now, somebody can check. I have heard people say that, yes, that happened in New York, and I have heard other people say that did not happen in New York. Anybody know which is the...
in New York, but it
did not happen in
some
New
other
York.
states.
So if it did not happen in New York, why do we think it would happen here, even though they tell us and threaten us and blackmail us to say it will?
Our understanding of that is that in order for New York to continue the law case, to actually to litigate the issue in court, they actually have to keep the affiliate program.
I'm sorry.
In order for them to litigate, they have to actually have to have the affiliates program in place so that they can show that they're actually harmed by the legislation, so that they can actually bring the case in front of the court. Does that make sense?
The Amazon people have to maintain their nexus relationship in order to prove they don't have one?
In order to show that they're actually harmed by the legislation.
I think it's an issue of standing. If they didn't have the affiliates, they wouldn't have any reason to be in court.
Oh, I see. Well, see, and all we want to do is back up their lawsuit. All right. Mr. Lowenthal? Yeah.
Update on where the litigation stands now on the New York and when we expect, if there are a ruling, to come down?
It is our understanding that the ruling is now at the Superior Court. The lower court has ruled in favor of New York, and it's
so in favor of New York was the lower court.
Yeah, and then it's now in appeals.
And do we know when we're anticipating?
Not sure.
Maybe you can check on that. I have heard that it may be relatively imminent, but do you have any? I mean, I don't know how long ago it was briefed or.
I'm not aware, but I can check on that pretty quickly.
Good.
Yeah, I think I had heard that one might be expecting an appellate decision soon, and that would certainly clear things up for us. The appellate court stands with New York. Then I say we're all in.
The problem, of course, is that these are state courts, and ultimately I think this is sort of a federal, regulation of commerce kind of issue.
So if the appellate court supports,
it certainly gives more indication that that it's more likely to survive.
However,
a challenge.
at that point, if Amazon conceded that, then they might do the blackmail thing, take the nexus out, right? But I mean, it goes back to the problem Ms. Skinner raised. I mean, the question is, so we should harm Barnes and Noble and Home Depot and Lowe's and all the people who do all the positive things for California, who have brick and mortar, who pay property tax, who pay sales tax, who hire people, and we should make an unlevel playing field for them, even though they are the folks we most wish to have here doing more job creation in trade for this blackmail sort of thing. I don't know. It's hard. Mr. Lowe?
Yeah, it's not only that. It's all the small red brick entrepreneurs in California who are now paying the sales tax, and they're having out-of-state folks undercut them by 10% or whatever the sales tax is. So we have put our own retailers at competitive disadvantage, and that's really what's going on.
Mr. Nielsen?
I would just observe that we're dealing with a budget here. This looking at this as a budget option, I think it's fraught with danger because I do believe that there's lots of opportunities here for litigation. We score a savings on this, and then the courts strike it down. We still have a hole. I'd say this is a leaky vessel to predicate any of our budget on.
It's not huge. It's really it was a series of measures that will be in here on tax enforcement, and it really is money that's owed to the state. And the issue is only how do we collect it, and that's why the Colorado model came up as a way, because it's more of a embarrass you into compliance model, but and the next one helps with that. I mean, it's all just trying to figure out how do we get something on the books that will enforce the existing law that could bring in the long run as much as $1 billion in revenue that we're missing every year. Mr. Delano?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just reflection on a comment that the Department of Finance made in its oppositional statement. You had said that one of the main reasons that the administration opposes this is out of concern for litigation.
And the impact on other California businesses.
Right. I was struck specifically about the concern of litigation because that certainly has not deterred the administration relative to IHSS or furloughs or a very long list. So I just think that's not a strong argument for you.
Especially when all we have to do is piggyback on New York. All right. Anybody, Ms. Skinner?
Certainly, this is a budget discussion, and we have the two proposals. We have the Colorado option scored at about $10 million, which I doubt would even bring $10 million. And we have the other option scored at potentially $300 million. But I think the other way we have to look at it, and it was already mentioned once, is that really we have our businesses that, and not just paying sales tax, but they're paying property taxes, they're supporting local communities, they're contributing, to the Cub Scouts or to the Little League teams or the various who are, as Senator Lowenthal mentioned, being put at a real competitive disadvantage. And they're now asking for this.
That's right.
It's no longer a thing of us just wanting to do it for a budgetary purpose. It's our own businesses and our largest employers asking for it because of the competitive disadvantage that they're being put at.
Mr. Huff?
Let me just make the observation that if our sales tax wasn't one of the highest in the nation, it probably wouldn't have such a striking imbalance between other states or those that do, those that don't.
Now, 50 states have this problem. It's not. There's 42 states that do sales tax at all.
Well, it's magnified when you have 10% in some of our areas. That's a big chunk. That's something you start to quantify mentally.
I see.
When it's
that is more money to us. It's
exactly.
more loss to us.
Right. And then to Senator Leno's point, I believe it was the legislature that sent to the governor the IHSS and stuff that ended up in litigation as opposed to him opining about something we're about to do here on this issue. So it's not really an apples and apples comparison.
I'm referring to the proposals he made. I'm referring to the proposals he made to us that we had a gun to a brain to have to accept, but they came from the administration. They were not our creation.
Back on this thing, I think we could spend a lot of time on it, but I'd be happy to move the Assembly's position on this.
Appreciate that. Yeah. Anybody else want to vote for the Assembly? So just to see. All right, I don't know. You want to leave it open? That's fine. I mean, if I have great hopes that why don't we have the Ledge Council check on that? I had heard that we might hear from the appellate court in New York by this month, and I don't know if that's still accurate or not, and maybe it would help people. All right, but page 3, Leo, you mentioned this one was our existing law. It sunsets. This one really does collect revenue, members. And it was, I think, a proposal of the Board of Equalization.
That's right, and we would recommend the Senate here. It's primarily extending an existing thing. People have submitted almost $10 million annually on their own. The Senate's suggesting adding a couple additions, which would be sort of a suggested lookup table that if you're not interested in collecting receipts and so forth, if you want to just go, well, I make $75,000 on average, I owe however much on the use tax, that would be allowable. And that the third piece is making it mandatory rather than right now you can just leave it blank. You would have to affirmatively declare some level of use tax or zero if you have or believe
don't buy online.
That's right.
Finance? Yeah, sorry, let me just hear from everybody.
I think the last provision would still be trouble to the governor because of the requirement then to have taxpayers keep receipts and detailed records.
So without the mandatory requirement, is finance reasonably comfortable?
I don't think there was any objection to just having the line on the tax form.
And the table. So people would have some basis upon which to base what they put on the line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know the governor's taken a position on that.
Okay. Well, if we, I'd rather not just extend it, but actually get rid of the sunset. I don't know. The sunset's gone, so now we have to I don't know how we have to do that. What's council? The trailer bill extends it. Period. But I don't want to put a sunset on it necessarily.
I don't think there's at this point a reason
so no
to put a sunset.
Extend it. No sunset. And have BOE develop the lookup table. We will leave the mandatory discussion for a possible something later, reopen if it's necessary, if BOE says that. Well, that was existing law, and the problem is it's sunsetting. So it sunset in 2009, and nobody had extended it because the bill did go, and I think it had anyway. So, I mean, if we don't do it now, then we lose it in 10. And it did bring in, on a pure voluntary basis without a table, I think it brought in about $10 million. So, Senator Leno?
Yes, question for Finance. Given that we have a use tax, a consumer would only know how much he or she owed by keeping receipts. So if the governor opposes the requirement of keeping receipts, does the governor support the use tax?
I think the governor is where most citizens would be, that, a tax that's extremely difficult to comply with just isn't fair. And so, if there's a way to make that tax work for people that they can do in a reasonably efficient and a not onerous way, that he's not opposed to that. And so for those people who probably have the occasional large purchase that they know they didn't pay sales tax on, they can voluntarily report either to the Board of Equalization or if there's this line on the income tax form.
Does the governor find the keeping of receipts to fill out an IRS form onerous? I mean, we all keep receipts.
We don't all keep receipts anymore for sales tax. That's something that most of us have not had to do for a long time.
Businesses, I think, are complying with the use tax at a higher level now that we've made such a big issue out of it, and they do keep receipts. And I think I've heard from BOE that I think the compliance on the business side of the use tax has gone up. All right, so the motion is Senate minus mandatory. On a Mr. Nielsen, or you're a no? Ms. Conway, you're a no? Mr. Huff, you're a no. 3-2 and 3-2.
No, 3-1.
3-1, sorry. On the Senate side, no, he will be when he gets back.
He's undecided.
Actually, I'm not sure. I don't think he voted against it in subcommittee, but that will be approved and open for Senator Dutton to add on if he. Okay. Collection cost. Oh, this was the errata page that got added. Yeah. Mr. Cohen?
Sure. Both houses basically approved a May revision proposal with slightly less positions. The issue in conference is really the trailer bill language. We'd suggest you adopt the trailer bill language, just deleting the continuous appropriation for this fund. We haven't seen any reason why the department should have special ability to spend these money instead of going through the regular budget process. But otherwise, we're okay with the Assembly trailer bill. So it'd be Assembly trailer bill minus the continuous appropriation.
Finance?
Chris Hill for Finance. We concur with the LAO. The Franchise Tax Board imposes the same collection cost recovery fee, and those revenues are not continuously appropriated to FTB, so we see no reason why BOE should be treated differently.
Okay, so the motion is
Assembly minus the continuous appropriation.
No trailer bill?
There does need to be some trailer bill language
Assembly minus continuous approp in trailer bill.
Exactly.
Okay, but they adopted trailer. I see. Okay. Yeah, just. Okay. I thought we had the trailer bill, but they had the trailer bill. Okay. All right. Okay, so taking the one line out of the trailer bill that the Assembly passed its Assembly version, does anybody have any issues with that? You're a no? Oh, it's because it's a position, or just because we'd be collecting money? Finance, do you score money for us doing this position?
Yes, $4 million in general fund revenue.
So if we don't do this, we lose $4 million?
Where does that $4 million come from?
From this person auditing a lot of people?
Essentially, this is for delinquent accounts receivable, and once the BOE actually collects that delinquent accounts receivable, they can also charge the delinquent taxpayer for the cost incurred to actually collect the money from them.
So if we get 100 more positions, would we get a commensurate amount of?
No, but only sometimes. But finance does score some of these auditing and collection positions as revenue generators. That's why we accept them.
All right. So
with more willingness than some of the other positions that we've seen in other parts of the budget.
This is an expectation based on previous experience with similar situations. All right. Yeah.
Just to clarify, the trailer bill language is going to allow BOE to use different collection tools like liens and that kind of thing. That's how they're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
Just wanted to clear that up.
But it's not a continuous appropriation.
Correct. Not a
Yeah,
continuous.
well, they're charging people for the cost of collection, which is part of where the money comes from. Senator Huff, what it is partly they're charging people for the cost of collection, just like you would if you're a bank or something, right? Right. That's where some of the cost is coming from. So, just to clarify everything, Mr. Nielsen, you still a no?
One of the problems here, there's obviously a problem to be able to pay this. Now we're going to assess it even more and make it even more complicated for the person, the individual, the business to retire their tax debt. So I just think that's a burden we don't need to impose on them.
Okay, just checking. All right, so 3-2-2 on the Assembly side? You're a no? Yeah, okay. 3-2 on the Assembly side. 3-1 on the Senate side. Okay, for the governor's BOE proposal. 4 million generated. Furlough revenue. Finance.
The administration proposed a BCP to provide resources to Franchise Tax Board to collect some of the revenues that were lost in the current fiscal year due to the furlough. And both houses approved the BCP, except the Assembly approved it minus the money for overtime. And almost all the resources would be used for overtime. So as a consequence, instead of generating $50 million in revenues, the Assembly action allows us to only generate $7 million in revenues. So we support the Senate.
Mr. Blumenfield moves the Senate version in accordance with Finance. Anybody? You okay? Mr. Nielsen's okay. Mr. Huff's okay. 4-0 on the Senate side. 5-0 on the Assembly side. All right.
It was just
Page 5, Mr. Cohen.
Sure. We'd recommend the Senate hearing. For those of you who've been to conference for several years, you'll remember this issue. It deals with whether or not the Franchise Tax Board can ask to have someone's professional license suspended as a tool to help them collect unpaid taxes. From prior conversations, I know there's some concern that, well, obviously you're taking away someone's livelihood. How in the world are you going to pay taxes? And this is basically at the end of the line. You've gone through all the appeals, all the efforts to, if they enter into a payment plan, they're not going to have their license suspended. So it's really more just kind of at the tail end. We've tried everything we can to collect the money, and I would think it's more of a threat. You certainly, in some cases, you could go all the way, but that it's kind of the last gasp effort to try to bring in the collection. You know, we think it's a reasonable approach here to try to bring in a little more money.
Mr. Blumenfield?
Okay. Question. Taking the tax issue that's in question may have nothing to do with their license, correct?
That's correct.
So
so there's no nexus between what they're actually being taxed. So it could be a dispute about a property, and then you're going to take away someone's ability to not use. But I mean,
No, this is franchise tax board. It's income tax.
It'll be income. So I mean, there is some. I guess there is some nexus in that. That's how they've
it could
earned
be
their
income for owning something. I mean, it could be not,
sure.
It's not related to their livelihood.
That's right. It's similar to the way we put a lien on somebody's house, whereas the taxes they may owe may not be property taxes. It may or may not be directly connected. So,
Hold on, I got multiple. All right, the issue, I mean, at least our view of it, just so people understand it as we talk about it, is the design of this is essentially the same as the design we currently use and have used for over 10 years for child support collection. Mr. Lowenthal and then Mr.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is, how large a universe are we talking about? How many professionals? And two, do we do this to corporate tax holders? If they don't pay theirs, do we lift their business licenses?
I don't know that I know the answer to either of those questions. In terms of the universe, it would, depend on every year. It's going to be a different
I'm
group.
just wondering how we chose professionals and we didn't look at other people that don't pay their taxes also.
I would think on businesses if they haven't paid their taxes that we would look to revoking their.
So you want to include that?
I believe that's already going to be an option in some case. I'd have to double check on that.
Senator Huff?
Yeah, child support's an interesting analogy, but I'm not sure it's accurate here because when you have contractors, if they don't have a license, they can't make a living. If you're a deadbeat parent and not paying your child support, that doesn't mean you can't still be making a living. It's just that it's a way to collect some money from them.
Well, you can't make a living if you don't have the license on the same basis that you couldn't make a living if you don't
Okay,
have
but
a
here's the problem, and maybe it's for LAO. You have many jobs now that are not just a simple
we've heard of this
contractor
one.
and one
Okay.
license.
I
You
understand
have
what
a
you're talking
prime
about.
contractor and you
The
have
contractors issue.
subcontractors. So if you have a prime contractor that's
Got it.
screwed up, now you're holding up all these other guys, or vice versa. Isn't that a problem?
We
how do
Senator
you
Huff,
rectify
now I know what you're talking about. We asked the same question, actually, when we first, and we are advised, although we'd be happy to get other folks in this discussion and leave it open, by some of the policy staff in these areas that, in fact, it can be drafted to fix that problem. We have heard that contractor problem, because most of the folks in this universe, frankly, are lawyers, doctors, dentists, accountants, and like that. But the contractor issue is a little bit because of this thing that suddenly they've gotten into prime and sub.
Right.
And I think we've been advised that there is a way to draft the trailer bill so that it does not hold the contractor liable for the prime's
We would
failure.
certainly want to
So-
see that language.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's fair, because I was going to raise the issue as if we did it, that we need to draft it in such a way that we address the issue. So maybe we should, that's fine, we leave it open and see if we can get somebody to draft the language so it's clear. And I am told that corporations are suspended for failure to pay tax. I mean, that's what happens. Corporations lose they don't have, it's not like a business license, but if you're a public corporation and you've filed incorporation papers with the Secretary of State, you don't pay your taxes, you are suspended by the Secretary of State from operation once that notice goes to Mr. Lowenthal. That's an answer to your question. So there is a way to do that for corporations. For single proprietor businesses, it might not be true, but for corporations, it's true. Okay. Anybody else have any questions or thoughts? If not, then maybe we'll just leave it open and see if we can try to resolve because I had heard that concern too. The contractor, we don't want the wrong person's license taken for the other guy's debt. That's kind of not the deal here. So let's see if we can try to draft the proposal in such a way that that issue is addressed. So, okay. Okay, now we get into the, finance. This was a proposal that was similar to a proposal that the governor made in January. But LAO?
Sure. The administration had proposed this connected with their federal funds trigger, which, as you know, they dropped in May revision, and they also dropped their support of this proposal. But we've all this year thought this is a very reasonable approach. So over the last couple of budget cycles, you've taken certain actions that have raised corporate revenues in the short term, and in exchange, you made some policy changes that were going to lower corporate taxes in the long term. Those corporate provisions are due to start coming into effect now, and so basically the policy question for you is, should you let that happen, or should you delay the implementation? So as I said, we think it's reasonable to delay the implementation, and in fact, both houses have done that. They've just done it in slightly different ways. There's three basic issues of difference between the Assembly and the Senate. The first one is timing on the length of the delay. So the Senate went with 2 years. The Assembly went with 3 years. We think a multi-year approach makes sense. Make the decision now, and then we'll hopefully have a little bit more certainty when the policy change will go into effect. We've been suggesting 2 years, but certainly it's possible our budget problems are going to continue for 3. The second issue is what's known as carryback. So this was a new provision that you put in place. We already have what's called sort of carry forward in terms of when you have a net operating loss, you can apply those losses to future taxes. It used to be 10 years. In the last couple of years, you've changed that going forward to 20 years, which now does conform with federal law. You also added this provision that is in federal law. The feds do it for 5 years, where you can go, if you've had a loss in a year, you can go back and adjust, basically reopen your taxes paid. The legislature and the governor had agreed on a 2-year carryback. So in its delay, the Senate eliminated that carryback provision while the Assembly left it in place, that when 3 years from now net operating losses are allowed to be used again, you would be able to have the carryback. We're okay with eliminating the carryback provision. I think there's 2 issues. One is just sort of on a tax policy issue of the notion of all this carry back and carry forward is really to allow businesses to sort of even out their income over a business cycle. 20 years is obviously plenty to do that. And so with that, we're not sure that you really need the connection to go backwards as well. In addition, there are, if you decide to go with carrybacks, I think there's a lot of technical issues that need to be worked out. We've never really had this on a state level in terms of allowing all of these returns that we thought were closed to be reopened. How is the Franchise Tax Board going to deal with them? How are they going to be allocated from a tax year perspective, which may or may not, depending on how it's implemented, have an impact on Proposition 98 and so forth. And then third, the area of difference is on the single sales factor, which is basically the apportionment system for multi-state corporations. How much of their tax do you attribute to California? The single sales factor, we issued a report several weeks ago that hopefully you received, where we raised questions with the notion of an optional single sales factor, which is what the legislature did adopt last February, which basically allows businesses every year to choose, do we want to go with the current apportionment system, which is a mix of sales taxes, property taxes, and payroll, or do you want to do only your sales? And so the option lets you sort of switch back and forth every year. So naturally, businesses in years in which they're making money are going to go with one system, and then in years where they're losing money, they'll switch, and then in conjunction with the carryback, you can end up with companies sort of maximizing their losses and then attributing them to prior income taxes paid. So in that report, we've recommended the mandatory single sales factor, and that's the Senate approach. So overall, we think the Senate package is reasonable, that you'd end up with 2 years eliminating the carryback provision with a mandatory single sales factor.
realize a lot of folks may not be ready to close on all these issues in this section, but at least it seems like we ought to hear them all. Finance, Senator Huff? Yeah.
This is probably an appropriate time for me to say something, as I did a couple of weeks ago, although I'll try to say it in a less heated manner, that we are revisiting things that were negotiated as part of the deal last year. That was not an easy deal to do. The taxes were put in place. This was put off to the future. The taxes, you were confident, would be extended by the voters. It was not.
Well, we weren't after the 1A was attached to it.
But that should not penalize the businesses. Businesses look out 3 to 5 years. And we're sitting here whipsawing them when we put into place something they start to count on, and then a year later we decide, oh no, we're reneging on our deal last year, because that's what this is, and yet you expect us to work with you in compromising a deal this year. This is dangerous water. I don't care how you score it. We should not be going here.
I think the difficulties are two. One is that, unfortunately, that whole package did not have sort of the public discussion and people's ability to really look at all of those, some of these technical, if you will, pieces of some of the provisions, like the carrybacks and the elective. Some of us did spot it at the time and didn't vote for it because of it. And, I don't know that it was the agreement in that broadest sense of the word on some of these technical issues. I understand the concern about the delay in terms of folks, but on the other hand, when we are asking everybody to, take cuts, keep the same, the question of whether we allow tax cuts to go into place is the question. And I would argue that agreement, had it held together appropriately, at least included many of the same revenues that are proposed in this budget to extend 3 and 4 years. And were we extending all of the other revenues the way that agreement contemplated when this thing was attached to it, then it kind of might all balance out. Unfortunately, it sort of didn't work that way. And I don't recall exactly what economics people projected in 2009 and what we knew in March, but I know the election was an issue then, and the carryback was an issue then for many people, and separately from the timing of the implementation. And so the timing of the implementation was intended, I think, in that package to go in the middle of when these revenues would be in place, and on that basis might have kind of worked. I don't know that now is the right time if we are unable to fund childcare to be, allowing new tax breaks. I mean it's just the world has changed.
Well,
and that I understand that concern, but could argue that a lot of pieces of that thing didn't make any sense, and a lot of pieces of it. I mean, just because we did something bad, doesn't mean you can't fix it.
Well,
that's kind of my view, but.
I might say that you said there wasn't public discourse on it. There was plenty of public outcry afterwards. We had said they wouldn't like the taxes, yet some members went up on it because there was enough of what they saw was good in it to go for something they didn't like to balance it out. The little bit of good that was in there, you're taking out for them if you consider this proposal. So I just hope that we don't go that way.
But the NOLs, were not part of the 2009 package. They were from 2008, so just... No, it was from the prior year. The NOLs were the prior year. The single sales factor was February.
It starts to blur after a while.
Well, that's what I mean, and that is part of the problem, is the stuff keeps changing and it keeps moving, and it's, and some of these, anyway, finance? And the other issue is similar to the other one, I think more and more, and as the LAO came out with this report just a few weeks ago, laying out exactly how this kind of could work, we're back to the same thing we just talked about earlier. What advantages businesses in California? If we're serious about jobs for Californians, why wouldn't we do things that advantage businesses in California over out-of-state businesses? I mean, that's sort of part of the problem. Senator Dutton?
Okay. I was actually just kind of taking everything in. I'll just make a general comment then, because I think I've been vice chair now for a while, and I actually came up with the menu of things when they were talking about revenue increases as well as the things that we felt that were necessary to offset the negative impact to jobs in the private sector. And this was one of those things that, I don't really care about personally one way or the other, but there was a whole menu of things. So, yeah, there was a lot of things that were all part of the discussion. I think that's the only caution I want to give you. I do think, in my professional opinion as well, that this type of change in tax policy will be detrimental to encouraging growth in the private sector. And I'm talking about not the private sector that's dependent on government spending, but the private sector that's not dependent on government spending, the ones that actually go out and create income as opposed to revenue. They actually create wealth. The other thing you need to understand is that you wouldn't need a lot of this if the regulatory burden and the tax structure wasn't so high now. That is the only reason why you need a lot of this. And I know people are concerned about different types of welfare to work and so forth, but what's actually been created because of our regulatory scheme and the direction we've headed, we've created a lot of corporate welfare in this state. Frankly, with all due respect to the small business operators that are doing solar systems right now, that is basically, you couldn't, if it wasn't for the tax breaks, if it wasn't for the rebates that are being paid by everybody, that industry couldn't survive. And so you've got to have an industry that's able to survive without government assistance in the way of revenue in order to be able to provide a high level and a quality of life. So just be careful. And the other thing I would do too, if we go down this path, I wouldn't count the revenue. Okay, you may want to think it might work, but I'm telling you, I don't think you'll see it. I don't think it'll materialize.
Well, I think it's not so much revenue. It's
here's what happens.
Getting rid of the loss.
They don't analyze any of this stuff on a dynamic basis. They strictly look at it from a static, and it's X, Y, Z, and then it won't be there. Well, they don't take into consideration the other economic consequences when you do something. And so I would just be really careful, because I don't think you'll see the revenue that you're going to try to score to save some of these programs. I don't think you're going to see it, even if you would take some of these away. So
These aren't
that's my opinion.
Yeah, no, and that is the ongoing problem. Finance will, if we allow these corporate tax breaks to go into effect, finance will score a $2 billion loss to the general fund next year over what we would have had this year. And I think that if they didn't score that, then I'm happy to. I mean, I do think as a matter of decent tax policy, having had the year to reflect on it, that the carryback and the single sales factor mandatory, I am persuaded by the LAO's report, if y'all read it, about how this works and what the impact is on California businesses. And so, I'm sort of inclined to go with California businesses this year over others as a sort of an incentive for them. It seems to me the mandatory sales factor, the argument for the legislation and the fact that it was in that package, Mr. Huff, was that it was going to benefit and give incentives for people to come to California. But that particular provision, the elective provision in there, kind of undercuts the entire argument that was the basis for the single sales factor legislation. And so we're trying to fix that. I don't find...
Well, I'm not talking about any one particular item here. I'm talking
I know you were.
about
and the regulation stuff we need to continue.
Totality of what we're talking about.
Yeah,
you just got to be careful, because when you start having... I used to teach a course for BOMA, real property asset management, and how do you do valuation. And one of the things you watch, you track hearings like this. And what is said here will have a direct impact on what people are thinking about doing. Don't have any mistake about it. It isn't just newspapers anymore. It's electronic media. Mm-hmm. And so right now there are people watching this, trying to make a decision on what they're going to do. And it's the attitude here that gets expressed is what's going to be an encouragement or a discouragement to them. And that's just the reality. So.
All right. Okay, we will leave that open for further. This is the first round, members. It's the opportunity to hear everything, not to decide everything. Page 7. Well, this is similar. This is just straight up, but LAO, you want to...
Sure. What you've basically, the Senate proposed is extending the two provisions of the personal income tax 2 additional years. So that's tying the dependent credit with the personal credit, which is its historical kind of pre-1997 level, and keeping the 0.25 percentage point increase on the personal income tax. As you'll recall from prior testimony, we actually think there's a strong case on the dependent credit to just make that permanent. That that was our historical level. So we certainly would two more years of that. We would see. Also, though, as you'll recall from prior testimony, we'd suggest staying away from the big three tax rates. Now, this is sort of keeping the same rate, but overall, we'd like to see those big three rates as low as possible. So ideally, you'd be finding another way to balance your budget rather than an income tax rate extension. So we certainly support the dependent credit piece of the Senate
And there are other credit things. I mean, I know our subcommittee, so people want to consider other ones. We heard a lot of them in our subcommittee, a lot of the tax expenditures, if you will, or credit options. There's certainly a billion more options than the ones that we have put on the table, but just so everybody knows what they are, we'll just kind of go through them. So we'll leave that open for thought. My other thought, maybe at some point get the information on what if when the thing triggered back on, it were 2 times instead of 3 times. I don't know what that does for anything, but and remind us of the income threshold. Mr. Lano?
Yes, a question for Mr. Cohen.
Sure.
I don't know that you would have this information with you, but if you could get back to us with it.
Of course.
And that would be on the 0.25 surcharge. How much did we project that would bring in additional revenue, and how much did it actually bring in?
Sure, we can get back to you. I assume it's down a little bit from the initial projections, but we'll get you the specific number.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Mr. Lowenthal?
As you're getting that, it would help me if you could give me an understanding of, let's say, a family of 4 earning $50,000 a year. How much would that be? Are we really talking about?
All right. Anybody else? Questions for return? Okay. Here's a familiar one. Page 8, the vehicle license fee.
Where's McClintock?
Elio?
Sure. So here, what the Senate did was basically extend the 1.15 rate that we're at now for 2 more years through the 11-12 and 12-13 years, and add an additional 0.35%. So you'd end up at 1.5% through 12-13. Again, as you'll recall from our prior testimony, on a tax policy basis, we think tying the vehicle license fee rate to the rest of the property tax rate, which when you include the debt is about 1.1, again, on a permanent basis, makes sense that you're not favoring one type of property over the other. You're taxing a car just the same as you're taxing a house. But certainly the VLF, we've used it as kind of a lever to provide tax relief, and we've used it now to raise revenue again. So you can't argue there's a real consistent state policy at this point.
Do you, based on your earlier comments about the big three, then this one, as a source, this helps us get outside of a couple of the boxes that personal income tax and sales tax provide, right? Because it's more stable, and when we had one, it was more stable, and it was consistent, and it was...
It is relatively stable in that, in general, you buy the car, and then you're going to... A big chunk of the base of it is already there, because then the next year it's 90% of the value instead of 100% of the value. Although the last couple years,
so it's a declining tax every year on whoever, if you
and then
until you buy a new car.
It always grew because people were buying new cars and more expensive cars. So when we went through the SUV kind of boom, VLF was growing very strongly. It has suffered the last couple of years as the new car business has really taken a hit. So, but it. Compared to the personal income tax, certainly it's a more stable revenue source.
Yeah, it's just frustrating. All right, Mr. Bloomfield.
Just quick. Since the vehicle license fee was first lowered by the governor, how much have we lost in revenue total?
Don't have that number off the top of my head. In that we've
a year?
We sort of the last couple of years, it's it's costing less since we're now back up to the 1.15. But
I remember a couple years ago, Finance was scoring an expenditure of $6 billion a year for the backfill.
It peaked at about $6 billion a year. Given that we turned it into the cost of it, we turned into property taxes, and property taxes for local governments were growing very, very strongly. Up until a couple years ago.
So it was costing us $6 billion a year to backfill the schools for the property tax that was shifted to the cities in compensation for the VLF. Basically, this goes back to the beginning of this conversation, Mary Ann's presentation on the
nice clean
on 1A is because we shifted the property tax to local governments in trade for the VLF reduction. Then the cost to the state that was being carried, at least for a while, I don't know what you're carrying now. You should be still carrying something because of the same problem.
It's a little bit less than
it'd be less because of the 0.15 being in place. It would be $1 billion or so. The difference between the 0.15 and the 2 was probably, about $2 billion? Give or take. I mean, it was about 6 for 3 or 4 years.
About 4 or 5 years.
And now it's about 2 because we increased the VLF this year, right? So.
Madam Chair, just
$35 billion overall.
Just one point on a piece of this. The administration does still support ongoing funding for the law enforcement programs. We had proposed to fund that on a permanent basis beginning in 11-12 through a continuous appropriation instead of using the VLF as kind of a package with our corrections reduction, which would get us budget year savings and then help us pay for that in the ongoing program.
Do that again? How do you pay for it? I'm sorry.
We have our corrections proposal, which would save money in the budget year and then would help pay for that on an ongoing basis.
How would that?
I'm just speaking in regards to the continuation of the 0.15 VLF for law enforcement.
Right.
I'm just noting that we continue to support those programs, but not through the VLF.
Well, I understand that, but you don't really have a way of paying for them. I mean, I don't understand how you're claiming that you paid for them is what I'm missing there. I know you're saying that, and I'm not understanding where the payment for that is coming from, other than childcare and.
Well, we would have to, as part of our 11-12 budget proposal, address that.
Well, yeah, you're proposing to fund it out of a general fund that everybody predicts will be $6 billion in the hole. Yeah, well, but why we would fund $500 million out of a general fund to something that's $6 billion in the hole is a little bit.
Well,
yes, Mr.
My point with asking that question before is just to sort of note that if we had actually hadn't taken that single action, what's that? Executive order. If that action hadn't been taken by the governor, that single action, at this point in time, we would not only not have a problem, we would have a surplus equal to our problem. So we'd have about an $18 billion surplus.
Well, it wouldn't quite work that way. I don't know if it quite works that way. I mean, it would have been, over time, not quite the same spending, but if we had been smart enough to put it in the rainy day fund, we might at least not be having as much of this conversation as we are, Mr. Dutton.
I mean, that's the.
If we had been smart enough to, in '99, when Gray Davis wanted to establish a rainy day fund, instead of doing SB 400 and the vehicle licensing, you'd be in better shape too. Yeah. We also did away with we chipped away at the GAN initiative, and the whole reason they went this route is because under the GAN initiative, we were actually supposed to give a rebate to the people of California, and nobody up here could stand the idea of doing that. Yeah, it was. And also the vehicle license fee.
Well, we did give the rebate of the vehicle license fee.
I didn't interrupt anybody. I waited my turn. So the bottom line comes down is there's a lot of things that you can point your finger at. I can point AB 32 as another thing that's caused a horrendous cost of trying to even live in California. And if you think you're paying a high rate now, just wait. Okay, you got a 60% increase in electricity rates that you're going to be looking at because of our policies. So there's a whole bunch of things that have caused a problem. Okay, and so just don't blame it on the vehicle license fee. It's a sum total of everything that we've done, not just one particular item. Besides that, you wouldn't have had the surplus because we would have figured out a way to spend that too. So.
Well, that's the real, I think that's more to the budget point is, if we hadn't spent it and done tax cuts and done some other things, then and put it in a rainy day fund, then certainly this year and last year might have been easier to handle. And that, I think that, is sort of the point. And when we, once upon a time, when we had 2%, we didn't have some of these other increases and other issues to deal with, and we did rebate. All I was responding to, Senator Dunn, was that we did rebate. That was the original Gray Davis deal, or it actually was the Pete Wilson deal. 98 was a rebate, not a. Oh no, it was Davis.
The rebate was actually
the 99.
I think it was
the 99.
Year
it was
later
the Gray Davis.
that we did.
The Gray Davis one was the first one was a rebate. That was the deal. That was a rebate. The VLF originally, that reduction in VLF was a rebate reduction. It was not intended to be an ongoing reduction.
I remember when we originally the P. Wilson deal was to have a ramp up over time, the triggers, and then we were accelerating, and the first stage of that acceleration was done by a rebate.
By rebate, that's how it worked. Senator Leno?
I think the trailer bill language in that year was that there would be the rebate or lowering
on a one-time basis,
as long as there were, quote, sufficient general funds to make up the difference, so that we would backfill, because we weren't going to stiff cities and counties. And if we're being intellectually honest about it, I don't think with a $19 billion deficit we have sufficient general funds. Do we have the political will to stiff the cities and counties, because we can't afford to make
well, now we
difference.
can't, because 1A.
Right. That's where we are now.
Anyway, all right. Multiple mistakes over multiple years. But if there was any of them we could correct this year, that would be nice. All right, we'll leave this open. Next, page 9.
Page 9, the Senate adopted an LAO recommendation to increase the alcohol tax for inflation. The last time the rates were adjusted was in 1990. And so we suggested that given the social costs of alcohol use, it was reasonable to use the alcohol tax as a targeted tax rate as opposed to going to more of the big three. So the rate increase would be about a 60% increase compared to today. That's been the rate of inflation over the last 20 years. And as you see in your agenda, it would raise about $214 million.
Finance, I know a couple of years ago you proposed a much larger alcohol tax. Do you have any comments here?
Why isn't it a fee? This is just part of the governor doesn't support any of the tax increases at this point.
But a couple of years ago, the governor proposed a nickel a drink or a dime a drink or something,
That was replaced by the tax increases that ultimately were adopted as part of the budget. The mix changed, but there was not a strong support for this particular tax to be.
But this one's real small. I mean, it isn't as, I guess my point is it was not as much as what the governor proposed in the same arena. And it is the existing tax that's been in place for I don't know how many millions of years. And the only question is whether every 20 years one ought to relook at it and think about whether one might have an inflationary adjustment to it. Anyway, Senator Lowenthal?
Yeah. As the LAO indicated, there are many externalities involved in the related to alcohol that cost the state significantly. An increase could be used to defray the costs of alcohol consumption. If, in fact, these spendings were directly relied to those impacts, if we use those for either the treatment or the prevention thereof, could this not be a fee?
It probably would depend on exactly how you crafted it. If there was a strong enough.
Isn't that true of everything?
Well, of course. I think counsel would back us up on that. So I think it's a matter of if there's a strong enough nexus there that someone who's drinking a beer should be paying for some other person's result of having too many beers and having a drunk driving accident. So we had sort of stayed away from that and just made it a general purpose
but it could
tax.
Be. It could be.
Theoretically, certainly, there's some sort of nexus you could draw there. I just don't know how broad you would be able to do that. And I guess I should, there have been a number of local governments that have imposed an alcohol fee on, say, bars and retailers to sort of pay for the law enforcement and that sort of thing.
Given that there is not obviously universal agreement on all these things, we'll just leave these open. It's a matter of presenting these, but I think they're all options. We have lots of options.
Wait a second.
I don't have agreement yet?
We're close.
We're close.
Close to agreement over here.
But all of these issues are part of, and the next one are all pieces of different frameworks that we talked about from the very beginning about a week ago. And if we could get through these last 2 pages quickly, then, members, we will have gone basically through the entire book at least once. The next 2 pages are related actually to the Assembly's proposal. And so, Elio, I don't know if you want to be the one to try to explain this.
We're happy to talk more about the Assembly plan at large, but specifically about the oil severance tax. This isn't one that our office has suggested. When the governor proposed one a year and a half ago or so, we raised some issues, including that we weren't sure why we were picking on the oil industry as opposed to all kind of minerals at large. We also noted the notion of a severance tax might make sense if under the construct of that we're trying to we know we're taking away something from future generations of Californians, and so if you raise the revenue, you might want to put it into a trust fund. Obviously, that's a difficult thing to do in a budget environment like this.
Land's oil account. We've had that for a long time.
Indeed.
Didn't it used to pay for higher ed? Does it still have any money? No, we fungible it. We've been stealing it all for years, right? Yeah.
And I can't remember what the annual.
But the question is whether we take it or whether we just give it away. I mean, at this point, it's being given away. So this is an improvement. I mean, I don't know how you say you're taking it from the future when the current trajectory is to give it away.
Sure. I mean, if the alternative is our current policy, I guess. I mean, we're taxing it on the property tax side, but
that's not changing. But the only change is give it away or equalize like the rest of the nation.
And I think that was our point on the property tax side. That the tax treatment is not the same across all 50 states. We've never sort of seen a thorough analysis that tries to capture all those different tax components of oil and try to line them up. It would be difficult to do.
Cool. All right, I got Mr. Huff and then Ms. Skinner. Sorry.
Yeah, on the oil severance, I just want to say that California, if you were to add up all the taxes on it now, is about in the middle of the pack on the report that I've seen. If we adopt this, we're not only the highest, we're significantly highest in the nation on that. And to presume that when we tax it, it's only the oil company that's going to be paid is to not understand the business model that passes expenses on to consumers. So it's just a nice way of hiding the tax and making everybody pay something else for not living within our budget here. But since the chair mentioned, the several pages being together, previously in this committee, legislative analysts indicated that the borrowing plan involves considerable implementation and legal risks. And I asked from Mr. Blumenfield for language, which we have yet to see. Evidently, the Attorney General has seen that because he's opined that it can't give a clean opinion on it. And so, given that, I'd like to ask 3 questions for LAO and Finance if we can, because everything that the Assembly is doing in this budget hinges on whether this cleverly named California Jobs Budget plan works or not. So the first question is, if the proposal were adopted, could a legal challenge delay the proposed securitization for more than a year?
Just to let me set the stage so we're all on the same. the Attorney General opinion that I think Mr. Huff is referring to, actually, I don't know that it saw language. I think it was in response to a Department of Finance request or this hoax request for an opinion on the legal issues relating to Prop 58. At least that's the opinion I've seen from the Attorney General. Just so we all know, I don't know that they saw any language other than the request specifically from Ms. Hoke.
No, they didn't. They just, as I understand it, they're just helping us create a blueprint so we can make sure that when the final language is written, it's done in a way that doesn't have any problems. So we take the advice and appreciate it.
But Finance can answer. I just wanted to make that record for the Finance.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what the AG saw, but what they basically said is that they can't they can't give a clean bond opinion based on what they have seen. And so what we do know based on that, similar to some past history, is that means that there wouldn't be any market to securitize. And if a budget were passed with the $7.5 billion of the appropriations from the fund, then we would have a major issue as far as an upside-down budget. We wouldn't be able to finance the budget in the current year as far as going to external markets for RANs or RAWs, whatever the need would be. We would also have a problem in that most of those expenditures are either Prop 98 or CalWORks, and there are some required payments or entitlements in those budgets. And so we would have to likely come in and take other actions to then balance the budget, unless there was some way to not, to change laws and not have a CalWORks program, or to somehow short Prop 98 by, I think, about $5 billion is what the Assembly budget has from the jobs package.
So let me just ask a follow-up question. I'll have the LAO talk about it too. Then you did answer most of my second and third questions, but just to restate, if this was adopted and it was challenged, you would not be able to go out without a clean opinion. You wouldn't be able to go out to the bond market. And if you can't go out to the bond market, you'd have a problem with securitization. And if you have a problem with securitization, you have a huge gap in our budget, in our ability to fill it for the short term and the long term.
Right. I believe the Assembly budget has about $7.5 billion of appropriations from the fund, if my memory serves.
Yeah, I don't remember.
I'm not sure if all of those are to backfill general fund in the budget year, or, for example, to pay mandates. But you're right. One of the key issues is that we will have to go to the markets to borrow cash, probably through a RAN, to meet our cash needs. And the treasurer has a kind of a rule of thumb that you have to have a certain ratio as far as cash available in that particular month to repay that RAN. And so, for example, I'll use some numbers for simple math. If we have to go to the market and get $5 billion of RANs, then in the month that we repay those RANs, using the treasurer's ratio, we would have to have $9 billion of cash in that month so that we still had their 1.8 ratio to pay that. If we had whatever the amount is of the appropriation that was in question, which let's say it's another $5 billion, we'd actually have to have $14 billion of cash, because that $5 billion would be discounted by Wall Street when they were, and the treasurer, when looking at trying to get that RAN and the ability to pay that RAN back. And I'm just using some simple numbers for math. It's likely we may have to borrow more than that, and it's almost impossible to think that if you have to stress that much from that cash position that we would ever have that much cash in the repayment month to be able to repay that RAN.
In follow-up then for the LAO, just, if you could comment on this, and do you agree that if there's a problem with securitizing it, that it creates a hole in our budget?
Jason Cisney with the LAO. The history that the state has had with securitizations of various sorts is that on occasion they can take several years to clear through the courts. Investors generally are not going to subscribe to securitization until all substantive legal challenges have been claimed by the terminal court, be it a state or federal court, the last court that would hear a matter. It's unknown, of course, the exact nature of the lawsuits that would be brought against this type of securitization. The legislature might have the option of crafting language to expedite state court proceedings However, one key issue is that because the state needs to borrow for its cash flow needs, the treasurer and the controller and the Department of Finance need to be in a position to do that roughly 70 to 90 days from today at the latest. So the challenge for the legislature in allowing the state to continue its normal operations through the fiscal year would be how to enact the type of securitization proposal that's now before you and ensure that the state Supreme Court issued a final decision 70 to 90 days from today.
So has that ever happened where we've gotten that kind of timely response?
I believe that there are ways that you might be able to expedite it. I don't know exactly how long the state Supreme Court might feel before it could be fully briefed on an issue. Obviously, it would require very quick action in order for the state to execute its cash flow borrowing to ensure that it can continue to meet payroll, payments to vendors, and all of the normal operations that it needs to have to function.
Okay, Finance, you had another comment?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think another good example is the TIPS lawsuit for AB 900. We've been doing lease revenue bonds, I think, since the 70s. The locals have been doing, I think, for about 50 years. But yet the TIPS lawsuit, I believe, held up any AB 900 bonds, I think, for 18 months to 2 years.
Yeah, we couldn't get a clean bond opinion, and then we came back and we had to change the statute, right?
Right, but yeah, we've been doing lease revenue bonds, I think, since the 70s as the state, and I think since the 60s for local government. So that's an example that not unique, not creative, very pro forma, legislative approval for lease revenue bonds, and it was held up for 2 years.
Okay. Well, thank you. And it seems like the question before the committee is then, if any lawsuit is going to hold this up, and this is likely to get litigated, then it's going to create a delay. The question is, can we work on such a superstellar timeline that everything turns up rosy and we get a good opinion back on the lawsuit? Or is it going to drag out like the AB 900 lawsuits for a couple of years? Either way, we've got a hole in our budget during a critical time when we normally go out and get some revenue anticipation notes or whichever vehicle we use. So for the Assembly, who we have not yet received language from, the question is, how can we really go forward when you have a $7 to $9 billion hole? Because you have a lot of assumptions built on this. You have a lot of programs that you're funding, the Senate has not. And I'll just say you and the Assembly Democrats are funding, the Senate Democrats are not, because we don't have this large program plugged in here. But regardless of what the Attorney General is saying, and I can't speak to that, nobody around here has seen your language, but if there's going to be litigation, we're going to have a problem. So I guess the real question is, how do you answer that? How do we plug this hole? And is this a waste of time in the meantime?
Let's not get, I mean, this oil deal with the page next to it was a swap, but it goes with that larger proposal, and we did pass it over when we hit the beverage recycling bill a couple of weeks ago, so that's kind of, and this is the last place on earth to have the discussion, at least in the first round. But Ms. Skinner? Yeah.
If we go back through this whole binder, and we have a lot of open things, obviously, in conference committee, so clearly we still have work to do and lots to reconcile. But if we go back, for example, on the Prop 98 question, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but LAO's recommendation was the suspension of 98, and in order for us to deal with the budget circumstance we're in. Now, I'm not going to sue the state, but I would wager pretty high somebody will if we do that. And
no, that's the only way we don't get sued in 98 world.
We'd suggest the government's approach is at least open to some legal challenge, where suspension's provided for in the Constitution. As long as both houses take a 2/3 vote, there's no real question that you can fund at whatever level you choose.
But but isn't the basis for suspension a certain test? And I understand that there's a question around the ability to use that test, and that's what we would be sued on.
No, you can suspend in any of the tests, and so you can specify. There might be some question as to which test you're suspending. Theoretically, there might be some question as to how much you owe in a future year to sort of get back to your long-term test 2 level. But in terms of the actual picking a dollar amount, there's zero sort of constitutional question about that.
So your recommendation on suspension is to avoid the lawsuit.
That's right.
Clearly, the real point I'm making is that there's a variety of things in this binder, whether we take governor's approach, Senate's approach, or Assembly's approach, that will open us to lawsuits. And now, whether they'll be as major or affect our ability to do the RAWs or the RANs, we'd have to go back through and analyze. But we already, in this current budget year, experienced lawsuits that affected whether our budget was balanced, and it's very difficult to make a decision based on threat of lawsuit, because almost much of what we're juggling now is in effect under threat of lawsuit.
I can certainly appreciate the frustration that it seems as though every place you turn, there's the threat of lawsuit. I think no matter what plan you end up going with, there will be the threat of continuing lawsuits from things that have already happened, whether it be the furloughs, the redevelopment, those kind of things. So it's really just a matter of managing the risk to your best available possibility to adopt solutions that maximize your potential to either avoid a lawsuit, or you can't really control who's going to sue you. It's to put the state in the best possible legal position to defend itself. And the concern with the Assembly securitization plan is the voters passing Proposition 58 in 2004, really setting up a framework where they were looking to sort of cut off borrowing to balance the budget. And so the closer a plan comes to looking like it's borrowing to balance a budget, the higher likelihood there is that you're not going to be able to proceed. Now, if, for instance, this proposal was $1 billion out of 18 or $19 billion of solutions. Now, it might, you'd still want to minimize your risk, but at that point, you wouldn't be putting your entire budget plan in basically one basket, to where if it gets held up, you can't go forward basically with anything in terms of your cash flow borrowing and just your normal operations. I think a good example of that is the proposed sale of SCIF that was in the current year budget, where we had advised you right from the get-go that we weren't sure how this was going to get done or what the rationale was, but it was $1 billion. So it was $1 billion out of, in the end, $60 billion of solutions. And so while that solution fell apart, it didn't sort of, it wasn't the single reason that the budget plan wasn't working, come January or so. So it's really, I think, a combination of, taking solutions that you think are legally viable. You don't obviously want to, do things that are suspect, and also just sort of spreading around the risk so that no one particularly risky solution is at the core of your budget plan.
Madam Chair,
Pardon, I got Mr. Blumenfield on finance. You want to make a comment
Mr.
on the
Cohen,
same
basically
thing?
just all of my responses to the question, but we do think that our 98 proposal is legal, and even if it is challenged, then that challenge wouldn't hurt our cash position. But we do not believe that the Assembly version is legal, but regardless of the legal issues, we do think it will be challenged, and as we already discussed, that definitely does hurt our cash position.
Okay. Mr. Blumenfield, then we'll go back to Mr. Huff. Oh, Mr. Fuentes in between. You've already had one. So go those two, and then back.
Well, in terms of implementing the jobs budget, and again, this is about creating jobs so that we can keep our economy going and not have this incredible unemployment rate. But in terms of doing a jobs budget, if you don't craft it the right way, then certainly there'll be legal challenges. And this is all sort of, this exercise is useful in terms of how we actually craft it in the end. But make no mistake about it, there are ways that you can go about crafting it so that we avoid these issues. And there are critical issues like what, Prop 58 deals with the end-of-year deficit. Well, what that deficit is something that's up to the legislature to define. And it's also, there's a big question as to whether end-of-year deficit means the amount that we're short in a given year or whether it has any relationship to doing a future budget. There are issues, in terms of whether you can securitize a fee versus a tax and how you write that, because there's different precedent for those things. So there's a lot at stake here, which is all about, in the end, how you draft it. And so I want to, thank you all for this discussion in terms of helping us get to that place where we can actually create jobs. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is about.
All right, Mr. Fuentes and then Mr. Huff.
Very good. I just wanted to pipe in just a little bit here because I think what I'm getting from the LAO is that there's a real sense of potential risk, but I think it all, if I understood you correctly, is relative to the size of the fund. I mean, if we were completely going on what we've proposed, there's probably more risk. And if you look at some of the things that the general fund would be made whole of as a result of this fund, that should reduce some of the risk because we're only talking about the general fund portion of it. So, I mean, as we're looking at that, and then you can even score the oil severance tax for $1 billion and look at a smaller fund potentially. But I think it all begs really the need for this committee to finalize the liability side of the budget. Certainly, we should be concerned about the revenue side here, but I think if we get closer to understanding what our liabilities are, then we can really begin to talk about the measured risk that we may or may not take depending on the size of the potential fund. So I think it's important that we have this conversation, but I really think that this is one that probably is not going to be finalized today, but most certainly would be more appropriate to have once we've gone through the book, figured out what the liabilities are going to be, figure out what kind of budget we're going to try to fund, and then figure out the relative size of that fund.
All right, Mr. Huff.
Yeah, a couple quick little things and then a restatement. Mr. Blumenfield called this creating jobs. Let's be clear. $9 billion in taxes, $7 billion is backfilling the general fund. I'm not sure if you heard that. You said this was about creating jobs, but it's $9 billion in taxes. $7 billion of that is just backfilling the general fund. So it's not really $9 billion worth of job creation here. So I just wanted to clarify that. But if I heard, let me finish myself, please.
And then, let's do it one at a time.
If I heard the LAO and finance correctly, a better way to put it is that the Assembly version, the scheme of the oil severance and the bottle securitization and everything is foundational. Anything you build above that collapses when there's legal challenges. The other legal challenges are incidental. They're on top of a way more solid foundation. Everything doesn't fall out from under it. You got small little components that might fall, but it doesn't jeopardize the borrowing. It doesn't jeopardize the budget. This will get litigated, and if it ends up that way, not only will we be losing the programs, because we'll have to come back in and make some emergency action, and then we're going to have to do some huge cuts. It's going to be to the programs you're trying to survive, to try to keep in place now, and it will be cutting jobs. You want to talk about jobs. We want job creation, not job loss. So I think that it's incumbent upon us to make sure we're moving forward in a responsible manner. Maybe I don't like your program. I'll just stipulate that. But if you want to do something creative like that, take a year to work it out rather than jamming it down now at a time when we can't afford to take the risk of getting it challenged in court.
Looked like finance wanted, but Mr. Blumenfield?
Yeah. Okay, just a quick response, because in terms of this backfilling of the general fund versus jobs, I mean, one of the reasons the governor's plan basically cuts 430,000 jobs. Our plan, and both public sector and private sector, our plan, the whole point of it is we've really focused on creating jobs, and some of that is with general fund money, but it really is about preventing us from going from 12.5% unemployment to 15% unemployment, and what that's going to do to the foundation of our economy. At least that's the way that that we look at it. And that's how the lens that we've chosen, which is a different kind of lens than has been used in the past in terms of how you look at budgeting. But we're saying if you're in a hole, you got to stop digging, and you certainly don't want to get out your bulldozer and make that hole even bigger, which is.
I think the question of it's just three different ways of looking at it, but the question then becomes, but if you borrow and you're paying that over 20 years, how do you pay it back? And then, you found a revenue source, but we got to look at that. Oh, sorry, finance headers. Wait, hold on.
I was just going to add to Senator Huff's statement that also the Assembly package also makes the 11-12 problem more like $15 billion, as opposed to our projection, which I think currently is about $6 billion.
All right, Senator Dutton.
Yeah, I guess you have to look at your definition of jobs. You're right. You have a different way of looking at it than I do. See, we got plenty of jobs that require government spending. And those aren't the kind of jobs, as I've said before, that I think you need to really be focusing on. You need jobs that aren't dependent on government
Teachers
spending.
and law enforcement.
Hey, look, if you want to have a good education system, you better be creating jobs for those kids to go to. Okay, that's one of the problems you have with rehabilitation and so forth. But no, I looked in your job thing, and basically you've got 140,000 jobs that you've credited on the private sector due to elimination of welfare to work. Those are all take general fund spending in order to fund those jobs. You've got another 25,000 jobs due to health care cuts. You got 161,000 jobs due to IHSS jobs. You've got 50,000 to the small business child care providers. There again, these are child care providers that are there because they get government subsidies and things to provide those services. That's where the problem is. You've created so many entitlements out there that the business community that actually is there to try to generate a revenue stream or an income stream to pay taxes and stuff so you can afford to pay for those programs, they can't handle the burden anymore. You've put such a heavy burden on them. And that's where the concern is. I don't disagree that these things are important, especially in a healthy economy. You want to make sure you bring everybody along. But you're pulling some of the people down because they can't afford to carry this heavy load anymore. So I just want to make sure you understand that when I'm talking about jobs that are purely in the private sector that are not necessarily reliant on government spending. So anyway.
We all have definitions of economy. Ms. Skinner?
Well, the trouble right now, independent of how the jobs are funded, is at this point in time, if we adopt a budget that results in the loss of 400,000, whatever, 430, 420, 410, who cares in some respects, if we adopt a budget that causes that kind of loss, given the fragility of California's economy at this moment, and the level of unemployment we currently have, we all know there's multiplier effects. So we increase that unemployment level. Those people then are not going to the movies, going to the corner store, going to the little restaurant nearby, or much less. Those businesses then become in jeopardy. Then we can experience further not only job loss, but just money flowing in the economy, which of course will directly affect state revenues, because why are we, independent of other factors that legislature and everybody else contributed to, a lot of the reason we're in this hole right now is the recession, is the global economic condition. So we have to be wise in our actions so that we are moving California towards recovery. So independent kind of our ideological views on how current jobs are being created or not, to act in this moment in a way that jeopardizes more than 400,000 is very dangerous for California's recovery. It's too dramatic.
Hold on. We don't want to do too much tit for tat here. But
there's 20,000 jobs right now that can be done, and the reason why it can't be done, it has to do with the 91 freeway, is because it has to be a design build. They've got to go to the market. They've got to sell it. There's no state money whatsoever. There's 20,000 hard hat jobs being held up because of the threat of a lawsuit from one of our public employee unions, okay, because they don't want to see them do the design and build without them. The Assembly just passed a bill on the eliminating of the grocery bags, plastic, that was pegged to cost 500 jobs right there with that one bill. So there does have to be balance. I agree with you. But I don't want to lose any jobs at all, but I got to create some jobs that will enable people to pay for this stuff. And unfortunately, the jobs in your jobs bill just aren't those kind of jobs.
Okay, hold on. Okay, wait. Senator Huff, and then okay, and Mr. Nielsen. He hasn't spoken yet. Okay, it's almost 6 o'clock. Just so everybody knows, and we have lots of time to talk philosophy. Yeah. Where's that Betty White commercial, right? Which one of us looks like Betty White? Yeah.
I'm not Betty White, but I think we do need to be, as Assemblywoman Skinner said, wise in our actions. And that's why we're having this debate here. We philosophically disagree on the approach, and we're trying to find some wisdom because the state will either benefit or suffer according to the decisions we make here and on with the Big Five and so on and so forth. But along the wisdom, two Harvard economists for Nonpartisan National Bureau of Economic Research recently confirmed that fiscal stimuli based upon tax cuts are more likely to increase growth than those based upon spending increases. And for fiscal adjustments, those based upon spending cuts and no tax increases are more likely to reduce deficits. That's not what the Assembly Plan is. The Assembly Plan is based upon taxes. And at a time when we can least afford it, oil taxes are not going to stop there. They're going to get passed on to the consumers. And oil, gasoline, we're not in a green economy yet, but it's on our goods movement. It's on hauling our kids to school. It's getting our people to work. It's every aspect of our life, getting stuff on the grocery stores. That is a cost that will get passed on. We will all pay for it. So these Harvard guys are not exactly a conservative institution, but their study says...
Is that the business school?
I don't know what it is. They're economists. It's the National Bureau of Economic Research. They're nonpartisan.
No, I'd be interested to see that. I haven't seen that one yet.
We'll get it for all of you.
I'll trade you my Berkeley study that says the jobs are...
Yeah, well, we don't trust Berkeley at all.
But they're in California. At least they paid California researchers to do the work.
That's the question
Mr. Blumenfield?
for LAO. Is the price of oil set by the world market, or is it set by the severance fee? It's a question for LAO.
That's probably a pretty complicated answer, but in general, I think what you're looking for is right, that most of the price is going to be determined by the global market, sure, and then you're just talking about the margin on the margin. State policy can
okay. So the point of that is to say it's going to be passed on to the consumers is just not accurate when you look at the oil is a commodity. It's set on the world market. We are a pimple on the amount of oil that's actually out there. So anyway, I just wanted to clear that up. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Nielsen.
Well, I'll wade in. I called this plan the other day convoluted and complicated. I'd rather now revert to my first response. It was bizarre. And it's not a good foundation for us to predicate a lot of hope in funding a budget that's already broken. These taxes and what we're talking about here is funding something that's already out of control and is broken. And the long-term fix is the economy. Now, we'll debate on what those jobs are and where they come from. I argue for private sector jobs and most important, sending the investor and business and capital markets the signal that California is a place to do business. I think there's a pent-up optimism out there ready to go if we don't send the negative signals. So where are we at strategically? I would just announce Assembly Republicans are, to understate, unenthusiastic about the plan as a basis to start.
All right, Mr. Fuentes, and then hopefully we're almost done here. Go ahead. Turn on your mic.
I would really encourage us to look at the liability side of the budget, and since there's a lot of different opinions on the revenue side, I mean, certainly the Senate Democrats have got their proposal, the Assembly Democrats have got their proposal, but in the short time that I've been here, we've really struggled to hear or see a Republican proposal. So we can most certainly continue, I think, this very good debate on revenues, But aside from the different opinions that we've got amongst the Democrats, I think to add to the mix, it would be helpful to hear from Republicans how they would deal with the revenue and the liability side. Now, we've been doing that comprehensively here in conference committee, but if this is unsatisfactory or unappealing or bizarre, then we should take a hearty look at some other options. And I encourage my friends on the other side of the aisle to do that.
Well,
you're the majority party, okay? And frankly, I did object to the process we're going through right now. We have abbreviated the constitutional method in which we're supposed to do budgets. And we've been telling you that, and we have been providing input. And I've spent a lot of time up here in budget committees and everything giving you our input. So you are the ones who do not want to have our involvement. Okay, we have given you suggestions. I have ran bills. I have given you everything I possibly can. I haven't been quiet. So yes, we have participated in the process, and it's not our responsibility to come up with a budget per se.
No. I don't think anybody was suggesting that.
And besides that, my first year in the Assembly, we did do that.
That's not what I said.
And it never even got the courtesy of a hearing or vote on the floor of the Assembly. So
I don't think that was what he was trying to do.
My suggestion is that we have to look at the spending part of that. And again, we've had very good conversations, and it's been very helpful to hear the Republican perspective on the liability side of things. But if we're all
and on the economy, I think what we're hearing
what I'm suggesting here is that if we don't like the revenue proposals that are before us between the Democrats on the Senate or the Assembly side, I'm curious to hear what the revenue proposals are from the Republicans.
Grow the economy by not overtaxing the people that know how to create wealth and also create the private sector job. No, I didn't say tax credits. Well, give them regulatory relief. Do some meal and rest period clarifications. Give the small business community the same things that were done back in the 90s. Give them the 40-hour flexible work week. Get CARB off their backs. Okay, that's what you need to do. Remove the regulatory hurdles that are there right now. The small business community cannot afford to keep jumping through all these hoops that you're putting them through.
So that sounds like a good out-year conversation, but in this budget year, how do you
stop? We can't keep going back and forth. Okay, folks, wait, stop. There is a lot of, we have talked both in spending and in revenue issues about the out years. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the economics discussion, because that is kind of what this is all about, is how does the economy grow best. There is a difference of opinion, and there's probably a balance. Senator Huff, I think, pointed out there's a balance necessary here, because you can't have all one way or all the other. We are going to have impacts no matter what we do. And unfortunately, Senator Dutton's right, we never can get finance to figure out how to score economic improvement in a broad way, even the governor's own proposals with regard to that. The other is that now, having gone through the book once, some of these opportunities to raise some of these other issues that are not direct in the budget but might have impacts on the larger economy, job creation, all of those kinds of things. The combination of the Assembly's proposed jobs fund and proposals like those that Senator Dutton just talked out is something we ought to think about how to create an agenda for. But I think goes beyond the item we're at, which is the oil severance tax, although they're all related. I get it. But I'm trying not to. It is 5:45. Just thought I'd mention that. Senator Lowenthal suggests we leave this open, and the next time we come to it, we bring Snickers bars. Mr. Nielsen?
Not into the rhetorical debate. I've said my piece on that, but kind of in the process. This has been laborious, but I think productive, and we've made some agreements. We have some differences. I would hope that we would find within the institution a greater sense of urgency of getting something done. My fear is that this is going to drag off into August sometime before we get tired enough to come together and make a deal. And I would advocate continuance of our conference committee and member-to-member discussions here, some quiet private discussions that we may have too that could result in other ideas brought before this committee, and immediate engagement of leadership on some of the, not a big five kind of thing. Those could meet periodically, but leader to leader, starting to really set some parameters here of the discussions and the debate, and where those areas that we do have agreement, leader to leader, member to member here, let's move ahead with those. We don't need to collectively wait till the final closing minutes, but I believe if we reach some agreement on certain things and move those ahead, that will allow us to more easily resolve those next things that are a little harder, and make it a lot easier for us to deal with the things that are really going to be hard just a little bit down the way. But most importantly, my entreaty to the institution, let's get urgent about this. We've got to move this thing along. We cannot be here in August, September, October, November.
No, that'll make it just as bad on the RAWs and RANs as any other liability scheme we could think up. But I think it is incumbent on all of us to be creative, and I think, what the Assembly's tried to come up with an alternative solution. Governor has one. And we're asking for all new ones that anybody can think of as we have these discussions. So I think some of the Senator Dutton's suggestions, if there are additional ways to look at that, if the jobs package that the Assembly proposed with or without the fund is something that has elements to that, we need to get to those. But Senator Nielsen, I think, is right. In the first instance, we need to start to find the agreements where we can. 10:30, I think, is... All right. On that note, it is people have been working, as Mr. Nielsen points out, on a lot of these issues that were left open during the course of the last 10 days. And as we closed some on Friday last week, you will recall, members, I think there are a series of other opportunities now that people have had a chance to look at trailer bills and draft budget bill language and such to close a variety of items on a variety of the various agendas. I think we can go back a couple things tomorrow. So hopefully everybody can catch up with the open items agenda, and we can start to close down some of those. I think we can almost completely close down the transportation. A lot of the resources issues, fair number of general government issues, I think, are ripe. So we have an opportunity to do some of that, narrow the gap, Mr. Nielsen, tomorrow. And I think the proposed time that I'm hearing consensus on is 11 o'clock. If that works for everybody. Hopefully we would not be more than an hour or two, because it's not tons of discussion. It's reviewing things that we've already done, but there are suggested compromises or suggested ways of closing that we need to hear. But the discussions should not be too lengthy. And then we can go back to working on more of those possibilities. So with that, we'll stand in recess today till 11 o'clock tomorrow morning.